Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the second meeting of the committee's investigation into grooming gangs in London. Today, we are here to continue exploring the extremely important issue of grooming gangs in London, and we'll hear from academics and charities with experience and specialist knowledge in this field. As this is a highly sensitive issue, I'd like to remind both Assembly members and guests to please avoid sharing any personal or contextual information that could identify victim survivors of grooming gangs. Please also take care not to disclose anything that could have an impact on any current or future court case, such as identifying alleged offenders or referencing cases that are sub judice. I recognise that this discussion may be difficult for some, and I encourage anyone who needs support to reach out to available resources. Charities and organisations such as London Survivors Gateway, Victim Support and the NSPCC helpline are available to offer support. Now, we've got a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our clerk, Sal Fazal, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Lodwell, for whom Assembly Member Clark is attending as substitute, and Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations as set out on item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 3rd of June 2026 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent and received? Thank you. Can we note the recent action taken by me as the chairman of the committee under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members to agree the committee's letter to the chair of the independent inquiry into grooming gangs in London? Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business, and I would like to welcome our guests. In the chamber, we have Professor Michelle McManus, Professor in Safeguarding and Violence Prevention in Manchester Metropolitan University, Professor Aisha Gill, Professor in Criminology, University of Bristol, and Lindsay Dalton, Chief Executive Officer, Evision Trust. And joining us remotely, we have got Professor Helen Beckett, who's a Professor of Social Policy and Social Work, University of Lancashire, Christopher Dagur, Head of Safeguarding Safer London, and Dr. Junior Smart, Founder and Business Development Manager, SOS Project, St Giles's Trust. So thank you all very much for attending. I shall start with the questions, and this is actually to all of you. I'll say who to start with in a minute. So based on your work, what do you know and understand about the scale of the operation of grooming gangs in London? Lindsay, can I start with you?
So based on our experience, we've been working with families since the early 1990s, and this is something that's been prevalent since then and still is prevalent today. Our referrals have not changed in terms of what we're seeing in the harms that are being experienced by children and young people across London. The patterns that are being experienced are similar to elsewhere in the UK in terms of the peer-on-peer, the sexual harm that's being occurring, the trafficking. So in terms of what we're seeing, it does replicate what we're seeing elsewhere. But in terms of the background and of the victims and the offenders, that is diverse from our records as well. But I would say, yeah, definitely something that we're seeing as prolific.
Shocking, isn't it? Thank you. Aisha.
Hi, good morning. In terms of... Good morning. Sorry, a little bit nervous.
Please don't be nervous.
Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation. In terms of answering the question specifically, I'm aware of it, in relation to the context of London as it sits nationally, in terms of the nature of grooming gangs and the kind of different aspects of it and how it intersects with other forms of violence against young people and children. I'm also aware of it in the context of the data, for example, prevalence rates and the number of re-investigations that are underway. I'm familiar also with some of the challenges that are evident in terms of the nature of investigations. For example, recognising the tensions in terms of understanding the relationship between class prejudice and institutional racism, and the drivers of grooming and different forms of grooming and what they look like. And also recognise in relation to various audits that have been done, the Casey report being an example of that, the nature of victim blaming that has implications for disclosure, and recognising the victim vulnerabilities and characteristics. Here I'm speaking about the relationship between victims and perpetrators, structural silences, for example, and what they may look like for different communities, black and racially minoritized communities, and those who are in looked after institutions, who have care experiences, those with disabilities, LGBTQI plus migrant young people from migrant communities, and the challenges around reporting the impacts on disclosures, and that's where I make a reference to structural silences, and the ramifications, if I may say so, in terms of multi-agency intervention around safeguarding. So that's kind of my broad and my specific understanding, and my current work cuts across these issues where there's an intersection between child sexual exploitation, sexual violence, and other forms of violence, which have implications for not only reporting, but how it lands with organisations. And also that broad issue, analytically, I also want to pay attention. I'm very aware that there was a part 1 to this briefing committee meeting, and I'm very aware of the narrative in which this issue, this very important issue, is framed, and how important it is to draw on evidence to ensure that when we're looking at these various drivers in terms of prevention, provision and protection, that we avoid essentialism. So that's just my brief approach to this.
Yeah, we had a lot of evidence in the first meeting, but you do understand that is a massive scale.
I totally. And I think the scale is in relation to the scale. Then it's the issues around recording, how it's recorded, what does it look like across boroughs?
The committee has read the Casey report, and so we know we're not coming to this fresh. We know quite a bit of this because we've read all those horrific various reports. Michelle.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation, and just to commend the committee on actually taking some national perspectives on this as well, which I think is really important to the London position, and just great to be alongside some fantastic colleagues across both the specialist organisations as well as academics, so I think you'll get some really hopeful, rich evidence today. I'll be really bold and say actually we don't know the true scale of grooming gangs, and there's a number of reasons for that, and I'll be very brief and can extend on this as we go along. So one is the grooming gangs, looking at Casey, specifically talks to child sexual abuse and exploitation. You also have the Hydrant Programme report before Christmas that talked very specifically, again, that was group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation. You then had, just before Christmas as well, you had the National Centre for Vulg and Public Protection with their police-recorded group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation. DFE released their deep dive report on child sexual abuse and exploitation. And then alongside this, you also have the Home Office county lines. And the reason why I bring that in is because when we try to think about the scale, we're talking about grooming gangs, not just from a child sexual abuse and exploitation, but also from a criminal grooming perspective. And we are not necessarily joining up from all of those reports I've just talked about, both for sexual exploitation and a criminal exploitation. So the issue that I have from a data and evidence point of view is that that is not joined up. And what we know is exploitation absolutely thrives in fragmented systems and recording, and the lack of recording. And the only thing I refer to before I go into detail elsewhere is that obviously the Commissioner, the Metropolitan Commissioner, talked about 2,000, literally a few days ago, talked about AI and technology, 2,200 data sets across 600 systems in London. So what we know is that that is disconnected, and he talked really clearly that if we were able to connect those systems, what we would truly understand about the scale, not just of grooming and exploitation, but across other forms of harms to children. So that's something we just need to flag right at the start of this.
Yeah, I was so excited about the Palantir project coming in and joining all these dots, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll concentrate on this, but I'm with you there. I was very excited about that. If I can ask our guests online, so if we start with Helen, if we may, Helen.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today, and apologies it's not in person. Thinking specifically about the scale of this, I won't repeat what others have said, apart from to reiterate that we do not know the scale of this. We certainly have anecdotal evidence. Junior and Christopher, I'm sure, will tell you more about what they're seeing on the ground, but we don't know the scale of it. As Michelle has said, our systems, including our data systems, are fragmented. But even before we get to the point of what's in data, there are so many reasons why young people are unable to come forward and tell us that this is happening. So when we engage children and young people in research, we know that actually it's taken a very long time for this to even be identified. So there is so much of this going on that isn't reaching our systems, let alone getting to all the challenges that Michelle has talked about there in terms of fragmented systems and fragmented data systems. So I can talk more about the nature and the challenges as we go on, but that's all I'll say on scale.
Thank you. Christopher. You're on mute, I think, Christopher. No. I tell you what, let's go to Junior, and you can see, Christopher, if you can maybe come out of the system and come back in again, and we'll go to Junior in the meantime, if we may.
Okay.
Junior.
Hello. Hi, good morning to you all. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I mean, this is a really, really important topic to talk about, and I'm really pleased to give evidence. I don't think there's much more than I can add. I think Professor McManus really sort of nailed it, and so did Professor Beckett. The big picture is, like, yeah, we've got no idea, and you know we shouldn't deny the existence of this kind of group-based exploitation, but we should also be wary of the conflation. I think when we talk about grooming gangs, everybody immediately thinks of Rotherham and the other sort of incidences. We've had terrible, terrible incidences involving sexual exploitation. There are other forms of grooming which will involve that kind of sexually degrading experiences, such as that characterised by, for example, county lines, drug distribution networks. And we shouldn't ignore the fact that a number of county lines have actually evolved, I dare say, into human trafficking, sex trafficking lines, often involving minors. I think there's a much more even bigger picture there, a bigger question that we need to ask ourselves, and that is, are we even identifying them as victims? Looking at every single organisation, I was reading some statistics from the National Police Council. Every single statistic seems to be different, and they're not even similar in size. They're different ballpark figures. And then also we have to consider to ourselves, where is the grooming taking place? Grooming has massively changed from the days where the older generation might remember, which is young people being approached physically. Actually, there's lots of grooming happening online. The online space is huge, giving potentially groomers and exploiters access to children and demographics that they wouldn't have had previously, or they would have been stopped en route to, it would have been easily identified and easily spotted. So I think there's a much bigger picture there. And I think in terms of what that kind of social media is involved in, and how young people can be trafficked, and how young people can be exposed, and how young people can be groomed. I think there's so much more work that can be done in terms of prevention. We aren't even asking ourselves the bigger questions, like where are these young people turning up, if they turn up at all to services. And I think that would be a crucial area to investigate, because of course, it can, by the time a young person comes forward, it's often they've been groomed for months and even years, and often the acts that they have taken part in, coerced or forced into, will carry that level of shame, that level of degradation, that level of that will despair them from coming forward.
Yeah, and of course the boyfriend model prevents people coming forward, when we would want them to, because they assume they're their boyfriends, and then that puts a whole distance between it happening and later. So I think one of the reasons for asking this question is I still get people that say it doesn't exist. You're all professionals and you're saying loud and clear, thank you, yes, it absolutely does exist. And I guess the truth is we don't know how bad it is, but I'm glad you're all saying what some of us know to be correct. It absolutely is out there, and we do hear it. Do you think that the authorities in London currently understand the scale of the problem, or is there still significant under-identification? Who would like to go first on that? Aisha.
Thank you. I think the issue around identification...
Is your microphone on?
Yeah, I think the issue around identification lends itself to that kind of issues that we've already highlighted, which is around definitional inconsistency. And that has implications, because the reason is that relates to incompatible terminologies in understanding of what grooming is, and its multiple layers, and who's impacted, and what does that look like in different communities, not only in relation to offline, but also online as well. The other issue, and obviously it's important to highlight, is missing ethnicity data. How data is recorded and how it's interpreted. And that has implications in terms of understanding, who are the victims and who are the perpetrators. And of course, there's how different boroughs record information around that. So I think it lends itself to that bigger question around the importance and speaking to, are there mandatory reporting mechanisms in place? What more needs to be done in terms of enabling harmonised definitions across boroughs? And that would then lend itself to speaking to effective identification.
Yeah, I mean, Casey brought this up, didn't she? I mean, she said it loud and clear that we need to have more maturity and honesty in debate about ethnicity of perpetrators.
That's right. And however, what's happened is that those recommendations have not been implemented. And as a consequence, we're not able to identify the true extent of the level of grooming and how it then intersects with other forms of violences. And I think it's important that we don't exclude the nature of grooming and its manifestations and how it relates to other forms of violence that young people are vulnerable to.
Yeah, we're going to be asking the Metropolitan Police in our next meeting exactly why this data is missing. It's appalling that it's missing. So does anybody else want to comment on do you think the authorities in London currently understand the scale of the problems? Does anybody else? Yes, Helen.
Apologies, I can't work out how to put my hand up on Zoom. I'm used to Teams. Yes, I think it is fair to say that they don't understand the scale of the problem. I think I should also say, in fairness, that is not unique to London, but it definitely does apply, and there are multiple reasons for this. And just picking up, Aisha's already talked about kind of some of the structural discrimination and the kind of framing of this issue. And I think it's incredibly important that we recognise the kind of self-fulfilling nature of conversations around this. And the reality is we find what we look for. And if all we're looking for is the kind of the narrative around Asian grooming gangs that has been kind of really promoted, then we miss so many other forms of harm that children and young people are experiencing. So for me, it's absolutely critical, just to reiterate Aisha's point, that we actually really engage in this properly. I first researched child sexual exploitation 17 years ago in Northern Ireland, and I can tell you that 17 years ago, I am seeing the exact same attitudes, the exact same behaviours that are being attributed to Asian grooming gangs. And Northern Ireland is one of the least ethnically diverse places in the UK, particularly 17 years ago. So I think it's really important that we do engage in kind of cultural assumptions that allow this to thrive, but it's really important that we divorce that from simplistic conversations that link that to race, ethnicity, or religion. Because white Christian men in Northern Ireland, I can see the exact same things happening in that. So I think there's a real issue that actually the narrative that has been pushed forward is hiding recognition of all of the different forms in which grooming gangs can take place. I did research in London about 12, 13 years ago, looking at gang-associated sexual violence. Again, we were seeing examples of what would constitute what you're talking about, grooming gangs here, happening, 15 years ago. It's still happening today. And I think there's a lot of issues. I think we have to really recognise the harmful implications of partial narratives that actually create a hierarchy of harm, that emphasise some children's harm and hide others. And this is not in any way denying or minimising the harm that has occurred by Asian grooming gangs, but it's saying it's as important to recognise the harm that has occurred by other grooming gangs and indeed by other abusers, full stop. Picking up on the point of definitions, that is really getting to the heart of why we can't actually nail down the extent of this problem. We are sitting in a situation where the policy definition of child sexual exploitation does not match the legal offences of child sexual exploitation. So you have police, and we had to point this out. We authored the CSE guidance for Department of Education back in 2017. And at that time, we had to point out the tension that the policy definition and the legal definitions don't match. So this is causing real problems around recording. And police don't know what they're recording against. CSE flags are used variably across forces, so that's not a reliable indicator. Some use it when they can evidence the harm has occurred. Others use it to identify risk of harm. And again, that is one of the problems. Every child is at risk of harm. So this narrative of picking out particular children who are at risk of harm, there may be increased vulnerability, but it's so important that we recognise there is no child that is immune from this happening, and we are alert to any child experiencing this type of harm. And just linked to that, and sorry, I will stop, but linked to that is we've just started a new project for MOPAC, looking at kind of assessing risks and needs for girls for gang-associated violence and exploitation in London. And we know from previous work we did on the Tackling Child Exploitation Support Programme that there are real issues with the risk assessments being used. We are using outdated risk assessments for child sexual exploitation that have no evidential basis and actually are ruling children out. So we are using risk assessments that end up saying, oh, low risk or no risk, just because the indicators we're using don't reflect that updated reality that Junior's just been talking about.
Well, that's really interesting, and we'll certainly pick that up because that is a concern. One of my concern is that this keeps getting pushed into county lines, and there is a difference. And people keep saying, yeah, but we are looking at it because of county lines. Well, no, this is different. And I don't want it all to be merged into the same thing. And then people say, well, we're dealing with it, because no, the grooming gangs is not being dealt with properly.
May I briefly respond to that, just to say I do think that's an incredibly important point. We do know there's overlaps, and we have to stop siloing children's experiences of harm. But actually, we've moved to kind of quite a singular focus on child criminal exploitation, specifically grooming gangs, and are kind of missing a lot, as you say, of that sexual harm. That some of that is linked to that, but some of it is not.
Yes.
And so when we were doing the Tackling Child Exploitation Support Programme, there was a bit of a sense across boroughs and across beyond London that, oh, we've got our head around CSE, it's been going on for a long while, we know how we're dealing with it, we're looking at CCE now. Absolutely not. Yes, of course, we're in a better place in responding to CSE than we were 20 years ago, but we are not there. And so it's so important that we don't lose the focus on still improving responses to child sexual exploitation.
Yep, couldn't agree more. Thank you. Christopher, I hope we can hear you now. Is there anything you want to join in at this point, or do you want to wait for the next question?
Can you hear me? Just checking.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Perfect. I did just want to contribute to that beginning question. I might have just missed the most recent.
That's okay. Carry on.
That's okay. So, I'd say for London, our experience is very similar to what Lindsay had described in the beginning. So, the fact that this is a long-standing and ongoing issue is something that we see through our everyday work with children and young people affected by exploitation and grooming. I think what has improved over time is the understanding of that wider context. As Aisha said, issues such as disclosure issues, challenges with disclosing, diversity needs, trauma, trust in services, all shape how young people present and whether they feel able to speak about what's happened. And I think the understanding around that has improved, which is positive. However, whilst that harm is in itself not new, and obviously there's a stronger understanding around the complexity, I think the key challenge is ensuring that that understanding then translates into consistent responses and safeguarding practice. I agree with Michelle's comments as well, that we don't have a clear picture, reliable picture of what the scale of grooming gangs in London looks like. From our perspective, one of the reasons for that is that children and young people who have been exploited are still often identified, managed, responded to as perpetrators rather than victims of exploitation. And that means that that true nature of harm can be hidden. I also agree with Michelle's point that exploitation is multifaceted. That links into what you were just talking about. Before I started speaking, sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, they are linked and overlap, but exactly what Helen said as well, that they are also distinct. So it's a really difficult balance for me because we don't want to separate them completely because of the links and the overlap. At the same time, we don't want to just put it all together either. So, yes, that's what I have to say at the moment.
Thank you. My next question is, we've heard that charity workers are overwhelmed by the number of children and young people coming forward as victim survivors of grooming gangs in London. Is this something you're also encountering? So who would like to start with that? Michelle?
Yeah, actually, me and Lindsay were talking about this before, and I do a lot of work with Catch-22 as well on this. Over evaluations over the last 10, 15 years, similar to what Helen was talking about, there is a huge and over-reliance on our specialist sectors in this area. When we did the Home Office, we did a Home Office DFE Commission piece of work, which was around safeguarding responses and partnership responses to county lines and serious youth violence, and exactly what's been talked about by everyone here. We had 2 sites in London as part of that study as well. And what we found very clearly is without those specialist sectors, we would really be failing our children, because what they are doing is picking up all of the stuff that doesn't hit the thresholds for children's social care, that doesn't hit the thresholds for our police investigations. So we already know. So if anyone looked at, and it's just to give you a little bit of context around the data, I'm a researcher. I will always try and give you stats when I can. So the DFE data, when they did the deep dive on child sexual abuse and exploitation, when you look at their re-referral rate, so this is just in the child in need census data, so it's already hit a threshold to get to this point. So that's my thing to caution, is that the highest re-referral assessment factor, so the thing that they were concerned about with the child, was gang-related, so that the child was involved in a gang, and child criminal exploitation, and that was closely followed at 33%. So 33, a third of the re-referrals around child criminal exploitation, gang concerns. Slightly lower was around child sexual exploitation. The reason why I raise that means that they are re-referred for that reason. We already knew about them. And the issue is that we're relying on our third sectors, our specialist organisations, to do the work, and they keep coming back into the system, yet they're not progressing. And we know that when you look at the DFE data, they're not progressing through our child protection plans. And there's lots of examples I can give about how that works from another DFE study that we just recently published in March.
Gosh. Aisha. Oh, no, Lindsay.
Sorry, Aisha, did you want to? Sure. Just thinking, just kind of adding to Michelle's comment that this is the first time, I would say, in the 30 years that we've been in existence that we've had to create waiting lists because the demand has increased, and it's all come at a time when we're working with reduced budgets as demand is increasing. So trying to stretch our services along this period of time where families are coming to us for more support. It also links to the previous question as well. Families come to Iverson Trust, and I'm sure it's the same with my other colleagues from charity sector. They come to us prior to coming to statutory services, so we are supporting them for longer. We're seeing kind of concerns and indicators earlier than it may kind of come into mainstream services like the police, social care, etc. And one of the issues that they have around that is that the identification of what they're experiencing and not being picked up. So you have a child that may be groomed in one borough, missing in another, exploited and trafficked through multiple other boroughs. Those systems are fragmented, as the panellists have said, so they're not kind of linking the experiences of that child. The families that are coming to us are seeing this, requesting support, and we're having to advocate for them for it to be investigated, for it to be opened up. When we're looking at that kind of reference point for parents and families that are asking for access at that point, that they're recognising something's not right, they might not be necessarily naming it as grooming, they might not necessarily be naming it as exploitation, but they're recognising the behaviours. In terms of kind of where our threshold is and where the statutory thresholds are, we're at very different points. We're accepting at the point of need, and so it's usually 12 to 2 years later that we might even see the start of an investigation. So I guess what I'm saying is, in terms of our charity sectors and where we're working for longer periods of time and having to do their hard work in terms of advocating for the risk to be identified that they're experiencing.
We are letting our kids down really badly, aren't we? This is shocking. Anybody else want to comment on that? Aisha.
Just to add to your points, which are really important around systemic fragmentation, I think one of the structural aspects of implications of the work of specialist services, particularly buy and fall services, is Asturity has actually had a huge impact on the ecosystem of support, and particularly how individuals, particularly from buy and fall communities, services present. So I think there's a real issue around the buy and fall gap and the provision, where there is less money to go around, and that has implications for providing support and prioritising, and that then does also translate into terms of trust, which organisations to go for to be able to get the support that individuals may need. So I think that in relation to the point I'm making here is that there isn't a shared accountability around multi-agency engagement and support, which means that sometimes buy and fall services are taking on cases which they may not have the infrastructures to support. That's primarily because of the deficit around funding as well. So just to add to that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I can see Helen.
Thank you. Sorry, I tried to Google how to raise my hand and I still can't work it out. Just adding to what others have said, I think the recognising the ask that is left on our voluntary and community sector to deal with this in the absence of an adequate statutory response is incredibly important. We've just finished a piece of work on what does a safeguarding-led police response look like to young people involved in violence. And there's a real pattern coming out, which we've also seen in other work, which is we rely on the voluntary and community sectors, including kind of by and with organisations, but we don't actually recognise their role. So we rely on them to pick up the pieces, and yet we exclude them from multi-agency forums and decision making. We take information from them about what's going on, but we don't necessarily share it back. So I think we have a real tension where we rely on the voluntary and community sector, but we don't recognise actually what they're doing in this space, and we certainly don't fund it. And whilst, Christopher, I do agree that we've got a bit better at understanding trauma, I still think we have an incredibly long way to go in terms of understanding sexual trauma. We are still funding services on a 6-session, short-term, fix-the-child basis. And we're writing up a piece of work for foundations at the minute about interventions for children following sexual abuse. And in the consultations that is coming up as such an issue, the short-term nature of funding that expects children who have been through the most horrendous experiences of their life in 6 sessions to be neatly fixed, to share the worst experiences of their life. And actually, that's quite premised on fix the child. And I think a really important thing we have to bear in mind for your whole kind of piece that you're looking at is, where responsibility for abuse lies, and it is not with the child. A child is not abused because they're vulnerable or because of their behaviours. They are abused because there's someone who's willing to take advantage of that and inadequate protective structures in place. So I think we really have to think about a trauma-informed and a meaningful trauma-informed approach to funding services to supporting children around it.
That's really helpful. I think we're going to flesh out some of these other points going forward. Christopher, your hand was up. Have you anything to add to that specific point?
Yes, please. So I completely agree with.
Oh, you've disappeared again. Oh. No, it's gone. We'll come back to you, Christopher. We'll come back to you. Okay, I think we'll move on because we've got lots more questions and there'll be time at the end for you to add anything you need to. So our next set of questions are going to be asked by Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel, both in person and online. My question is, and I don't want to get caught up in the issue of terminology, and there's a very specific reason why I ask this. We've been using the term grooming gangs. Throughout this investigation, I know it's used across the board. I want to ask you, in your professional opinions, does that terminology help or hinder the identification of victims and perpetrators? And the reason I ask very specifically is because recently I was listening to a Radio 4 programme about this, and the presenter very clearly said that professionals do not use the term grooming gangs because they don't find it helpful. And I think Professor Beckett referred to, people slipping through the net because of definitions. So I'm going to open it out, whoever would like to answer that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Some of that has been explained today, but I think it goes back to the point that I raised before, where we've kind of associated grooming gangs from a child's sexual exploitation and abuse perspective. And I think, the experiences, that I've spoken to with Junior about from St. Giles and others and with Lindsay, that are those ones that are absolutely on the ground with this. It is wider than that. So I think there is a danger at the moment. We have an association of grooming gangs being sexual exploitation and abuse. And, Casey very specifically kind of unpacks that as, 2 or more people that are part of that organiser network. And if you look at the Hydrant programme, they term it as group-based. It's essentially the same thing that we're talking about, which is 2 or more people that are networked or connected. Connected is probably just the easier way to phrase that. So I do think it's really challenging within our systems. We don't have it in terminology flagging within our police systems, labelled that way. It's not an operational definition in policing. As I've said, from a county lines perspective in policing versus a child sexual exploitation. And then in the DFE data, we are working really closely with DFE at the moment around the children's social care recording systems to try and unpack what we mean by that. And that is literally just trying to capture group base. So that's just 2 or more people. And then the factors that might be sexual, might be criminal, it might be gang related that they're also involved with that capture that. So for me, at the moment, it is hindering because it seems to have that lens on sexual exploitation, and it is wider than that. The experiences of our children are also criminal related, and we need to be careful about how we're understanding that picture as well. Absolutely, coming back to your point, Chair, before about, the complexities of needing to know, whilst not completely joining them up, there are different expertise that's needed. And just on that last point, when we did the initial evaluation for Home Office and DFE on county lines and looking at the safeguarding responses, when we went out and asked people about county lines, they couldn't talk about grooming gangs and exploitation from a criminal perspective without also saying it includes a lot of the time the overlapping harms of sexual. This is the challenge we've got. So essentially, it's probably not helpful right now.
So what would you use? What would a correct catch-all terminology be? Because it's about making sure that neither perpetrators nor victims slip through the net because of definition. What would you use?
I think we've got to go with the harms, that the cumulative harms. That's the issue that we've got. So the thing that we found, first of all, you need to understand if there's a network. So the group-based tagging is really important. So what you're asking about there is, from a perpetrator perspective, are there more people connected to this survivor, this victim, this child than we know about? Because that's going to impact on what our responses are from an investigative perspective. From the child's perspective, we need to flag what harms are being done to the child. So that's going to be really important. So they're 2 almost separate things, which is why you can see there's some real issues around the definition issue here, because the police will be focusing on the perpetration and the victims, in our voluntary sector and our specialist services will be looking at it from a victim side of thing. But it's really important to flag whether it's group-based, but the harm type that they are also experiencing.
Thank you. I just wonder, would anyone from the voluntary sector like to respond? Lindsay?
Just to add a little more onto that, I do think it's unhelpful from what we're seeing, whether it's delaying the discovery or the identification in our experience of families, in that families, it's twofold really. Families might not see themselves in the depiction of how grooming gangs is portrayed in media, or where they may experience the kind of description of that, but also equally we're seeing services that themselves are subjected to those stereotypes of thinking that doesn't fit what I understand grooming gangs to be, and therefore that delays responses. We see families not given the support that they need for their children early enough, and we see an escalation as a result of that. So I think we have to acknowledge the bias and stereotypes that come with terms around grooming gangs and how that impacts then on delayed responses and services that are offered to families and victims.
And again, what terminology would you think is more helpful?
I agree with Michelle. I think if we look at the harms that are being experienced and also the features of those harms, is it networked, is it grouped? I think that's where we need to kind of capture that and move away from these capture-all titles that are not helpful.
And Junior, did you want to add anything to that? I think Junior's frozen. Okay, can we move on?
Can I just add, just to agree with my colleagues? I think the issue is around the cumulative aspects of what's being done, and I think it's really important that we pay attention to that in terms of the tactics that are used, consideration for the environment in which the harm is being experienced, how it's articulated by individuals who are impacted, because language matters in terms of naming the harm that's being done. And that will be layered in terms of intersectional experiences and understanding that in some situations there will be grey areas in between the broader definitions that may be understood by agencies and what's going on at an individual level. So I want us to I'm appealing to understanding what's not said and the context in which it's not said in terms of the violence that's being done and the various indicators that you can use to cumulatively establish the nature of the abuse that's being done. And so that's really, really important. And the reason why that we pay attention to this is that definitions themselves can land themselves into terms of not capturing what is outside of that frame. Because different forces and different agencies will have different approaches, like the perception of, and this is problematic too, around localised grooming or street grooming or internal trafficking. And that level of fragmentation has serious consequences for recording, identifying, but also recognising the tools of coercive control which play out and which are being used in different ways. So we have a huge problem around definitions, data recording, and then subsequently how then we respond. And I think that's work in progress. But what we have to keep in mind is how individuals themselves experience that harm. And cumulatively, we need to register that.
Thank you. And I think, Junior, have you unfrozen now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. I'm so sorry. I had a bit of a problem as it goes with IT. I just wanted to echo the comments of Miss McManus. I think the problem that we've got to be really careful about the sort of language we use. I'm sure you remember all of the issues we went through around having the term gang, and then the impact that had being being continually identified or being used synonymously with a specific part of our population. And I think the problem is with the term grooming, it's become almost sort of like shorthand for child sexual exploitation, and particularly for I'd go as far as to say a specific public image of what a grooming gang looks like. But I think the reality is that does the victims injustice, because grooming is much bigger than that. It's absolutely much bigger than that, and it's actually the method used by the exploiters. It's not a typical. It should never be used to describe like a group of people. Is actually the method, which is to create access, dependency, shame, silence, control. So my concern is that if we build a response that only understands grooming underneath that terminology, we miss out the children that are actually the victims in all of this. And I think that is a much wider context. As my professor Simon Harding used to say to me all the time, the language that we use dictates actually our perceptions and how we pursue the outcomes that we then go about getting. And I just think language, like anything, it can either be used to build bridges or close doors. And definitely when we're talking about CSC, when we're talking about all of that sort of issues around that, we need to be keeping the people that are involved in it centre first and foremost.
Just to say, I'm just supporting that comment, because I think one of the issues here is around the racialization, because it actually compounds and it fails to record the nature of who does what to whom under what circumstances. And so it actually creates a misrepresentation of the landscape of offending. So I think it's really important that we don't assume that this kind of violence only happens in one particular community, because I think it lends itself to stigmatizing those communities, but not recognizing that actually perpetrators sit in diverse spaces.
Sure.
and diverse communities.
Right, thank you. I'm aware that both our other panellists would like to come in, but the chair's asking me to move on. So what I'm going to do, if I can summarise, I think you've all agreed, and I've seen nodding on screen as well, that actually the term grooming gangs means that we do exclude both perpetrators and victims as well. Is that correct? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to keep this quite... It's got to be very quick. We're so late.
I really want. I think everybody was talking about not liking the grooming gang, but I didn't hear a reference that you want us to use.
I think we talked more about the kind of group-based, which is in the recording at the moment, so making sure that we absolutely identify the group-based aspect.
No, like just what if you're not calling it grooming gangs, what are you calling it?
So late.
Well, for me,
We're running really late.
sorry.
I don't understand if it's a recommendation to not call it grooming gangs, what are we calling it?
The things that you need to understand is that the terminology, I mean, from my opinion as well, I don't think we should be using grooming gangs. What we're talking about is the harm. Are we talking about the harm to children, which is understanding the exploitation type? And I think it goes back to the point that
I think you were talking about. There's not. Okay, so you're not actually giving us any. Okay.
I think what we're alluding to is really important to recognise.
I wondered if I'd missed the word of what you suggested, but there wasn't one. Sorry.
Yeah. I think you raised.
Wants to go on.
If I may, just interject. I just want to say I think you raise a really good point, but I think it's important to highlight that we are flagging the implications of broad responses and how that impacts on understanding the cumulative aspect of harm as it's experienced by victims.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry we're moving on. This subject, we could talk all day. I think one of the issues here is if you said to people in the street about grooming gang, they now know what we're talking about. I accept what you're saying, but if we start messing around with names, we've got to capture the public's acknowledgement that this whole ghastly thing's happening, and they do at least get some idea of it at the moment. I'm going to cut my next question very, very short. We've been told that that grooming gangs operate nationally, moving children and young people in and out of London to sexually exploit them. So just very basically, anybody, do you have any evidence of that in your research? Lindsay?
I'll keep it very brief.
Thank you.
Yes, we do. From all parts of the UK, in and out of London, we have numerous cases where we could give evidence. Obviously, I don't want to give any descriptions of that because I don't want to cause any risk to the children and families that we work with. But there is evidence that children are being trafficked through current cases as well as historic.
Purely for sex?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interlinked with other issues, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Michelle?
Some of the research that we've done, both for County Lines, we've done some work for the National County Lines Coordination Centre. We've also done some work nationally around the movement of kind of exploitation groups around this. And we absolutely do see the movement in and outside of London as well as other city areas as well. So it's a very sort of typical model. But what we have seen change over the years is that become a more localised model. And that is evidenced in various reports, both from, as Lindsay said, both from a sexual perspective, but also from the criminal side of things as well. And I think London is particularly an area where you're going to see more of that because of the nature of London and the size and the diversity of London around it as well. The only thing to flag as well is we've seen, so I'm part of a number of national and regional groups around exploitation, more generally child exploitation, and we're also seeing an increase in use of females in both a criminal and sexual capacity that are being moved further. Now, this is seen to be linked to concerns around stop and search from policing, where there is a concern about if we're going to give the girls more, they're going to be the ones that are going to travel more. That's some of the evidence we've got now, is that females are travelling further and they're younger as well. And that's because, again, you talked about the boyfriend model before, they're being coerced into these boyfriend models. And actually there's awareness that there is often a reluctance or a hesitancy or a nervousness about stop and searching of females if there's concerns around activity. But it goes back to the point before around labels, seeing them as perpetrators, and how we actually respond to that. But yeah, females is a concerning thing that we're seeing in the patterns in further movement. Boys seem to be more local, that we're seeing a bit more of that in and out.
Thank you. You mentioned a couple of reports. I'll get somebody to get the names of those reports, because we'll talk to the police about that. As brief as you can, please, Assemblymember Handash.
Great, thank you. So through our reports, we've seen a number of risk characteristics for children that are at risk of exploitation. So young people who are in care, young people who have gone missing. I think one of you referenced migrants as well. In the kind of reading of the narratives, I haven't seen unaccompanied asylum-seeking children coming up, and it's an area of concern for me. I wondered whether in your evidence or your work as a VSC Charities, whether the experience of You Ask Children has come through clearly at all, and anyone who wants to take that question would be great.
If it's okay, I might like to just say something. The reality is, because I was fortunate enough to do some work with the Refugee Council, and I'm not speaking on their behalf, but the reality is, for those that are here, there's a big, massive misconception of who they are and what they're entitled to. The reality is they are off the radar. They are almost like the voiceless, because they are easy targets for those that are looking to groom them and ultimately exploit them. It isn't the issue that we're presented with commonly, that they arrive here and they're getting properties and they're being massively looked after. These are people that will struggle to get access to finances, and so they are easy targets for the exploiters to get hold of and to groom and to push into any form of crime that has got a financial incentive. And so they are largely kept off of the radar. Everything that they do, they're threatened with their potential stay here. So often when they're arrested, they stay quiet, and often they're just very easy to disappear. We've got no knowledge of the numbers of people that are involved in this stuff, let alone those that are here illegally that aren't registered on any system. So that's an even bigger question. Who are they? Where are they? And then how are they exploited, and to what benefit? And that's a big issue for us.
Thank you. Assemblymember Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Gill, you have touched on this, but I think we do need to be really clear about this. As you know, public debate attributes grooming gang offending to often a single or ethnic or religious group. What does the evidence actually tell us in terms of London and who the offenders are? And what are the risks when the narrative is framed in the way that it seems to be in the public domain?
Sorry. My work has spoken to this issue for a number of years in terms of the implications of cultural framing and the ramifications of that for disclosure, in particular diverse communities that are harmed. I think one way of thinking about it, that when we look at abuse in other institutions, for example, the church or boarding schools or professional support, what happens is that the framing is not done in the same way. It's not ethnicity or biological explanations are not given in the same way. And my work and that of others, the Casey audit, colleagues at Jay's report, Professor Colleen Furman's work and others, saying that there are other factors beyond culture which are really important to engage with in terms of institutional factors that are really important to respond to. So I think, for me, that essentialism has ramifications. I think it's too easy and I think it's very lazy. The data from, and I don't have it to hand, but the claims around certain communities, I think that there has to be a recognition that even in the audits that have been done, that the data is not completely saying that it's happened to one community. That, you know, if you look at the statistics in terms of I think the Casey report, between 46 and 49%.
I can give you the exact stats.
Yeah. So I think this hijacking, this essentialism, that if we just take the terminology of grooming itself, the signifiers in itself is racialized. It has ramifications in terms of how it's then reported, how it's understood. And we spoke about the public. The public has a perception of grooming which is driven by a media narrative, which is really, really harmful. So I think collapsing racialized labels doesn't do anybody any good. And this is something that the Casey audit highlighted. And I think it's really important that we engage with that in terms of the ramifications of particular folk devils, which frames it in terms of moral panics and then also violence.
You know, we'd love to go into this more. Unfortunately, we've got to move on, but thank you very much. And
yeah, just data, just to give you some stats, because I will always be that person for you. So the best of the statistics nationally that we know is around 37% of the cases recorded for group-based contact, child sexual abuse and exploitation. Ethnicity is recorded for suspects in 37% of cases. 37%, so just over a third. Slightly higher for the victims, so we're not even good at recording self-defined ethnicity. For victims, it's 44%. So we're very, very poor at recording it. And just to go to the point, to give you another stat, when we look at the Hydrick report around group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation, using their complex and organised database, we know that out of the 4,450 contact group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation cases, a third were recorded as familial.
And I just want to add to the data. I've just managed to find...
I am sorry, Professor Gill, we are going to have to move on. My apologies. The Chair may actually get up and hit me if we don't. But thank you very much, both of you.
It's true. And I do have to say, though, if there is overrepresentation of any group, it is absolutely vital that we say that. And whether they're ethnic groups, whether they're political groups, whether they're anybody, personally, I don't care. Whoever we find doing this heinous crime has got to be called out, and we mustn't shy away from saying who it is, what it is, or anything else, whoever they are. Right, I'm going to move on now to Assemblymember Roberts.
Thank you. Good morning. Just touching on the use of social media and online platforms which these group-based perpetrators are using. How are they using social media and online platforms for child sexual exploitation and abuse? And how can it be prevented? Indeed, can it be prevented? Anybody who would care to have a go at that one?
So I would say it's definitely a feature, if not all, of the referrals that we have currently now, whether that's how the exploitation and grooming started in terms of that initial contact, or whether it's being used to facilitate the exploitation and grooming. So I would say the features on the online platforms now that give access to those that are looking to groom and offend against children, and that reach into their lives 24/7, that's something that, you know, it has been increasing over the years as the development of the apps. The fact that they are able to track the movement of children and being able to dictate what the children should do. The fact that they are able to create relationships. We have to acknowledge that exploitation happens relationally, and so our response has to be a relational response to that as well, in understanding that. But in terms of the online platforms that are being used, they're created either as a one-off contact to see, you know, what that response of the child is, or they use it to create a relationship that then it may be that those apps are encouraging children to create self-images that are then used to blackmail them to do other crime. You know, it might be from a crime specific in terms of county lines or exploitation in other formats, but also to extend the reach of those people into the child's life to facilitate more crimes against them by blackmailing them that they're going to out the pictures or share it publicly, etc. I think in terms of the response, obviously we've had the announcement of the ban for young people that are coming out, and we have largely a twofold view on this. One, we do need to be doing more to protect children, so anything that we can do is welcomed. From my perspective of Iverson Trust, and I know my colleagues similarly have fears that we are driving or risk to drive some of this further underground, because exploiters will respond in that they will make sure children have the devices, they will connect the children to the devices regardless of whether families are giving them or not. And there's additional risk with that.
I'm doing it now.
Just to support that, I think you raise a really good point about the relational experiences, and I think we need to recognise that the online is also connected to offline in terms of the way in which vulnerable individuals are coerced and persuaded, and that there's a need to map the digital patterns on multiple platforms. I think that's really, really important. And I think it lends itself also to kind of highlighting that this is beyond cultural specificity, that we don't, it doesn't have a racialized element to it. So I just want to emphasize that in terms of the manifestations of online abuse as well, and what that looks like for different communities.
No, absolutely. I agree entirely. Do we find that the initial use of social media and online platforms, does that start with more of a stranger-based approach, or is it usually within familial relationships, friendship groups, things like that? I mean, oh, I do apologise. Thank you, Chair. I was remiss. We'll come back to that. Who had their hand up first, Chair? I don't know. Thank you. Oh, Christopher. I mean, normally I'd say put it in the chat, but we can't see that.
It's not Christopher's day, is it?
No.
I'd go on to Helen if I were you.
Yes, Helen.
Yeah, thank you. I just reiterate what has been said around kind of use of online spaces and the broad breadth of perpetration and who that's by in those spaces. We also know that in some ways talking about online, offline is a really artificial distinction that doesn't exist in the same way for young people as me as a woman in my 50s. But I think certainly some of the patterns we're seeing is how actually the whole process of grooming and approach and desensitization is very much faster in an online space. And the other thing I would just add in, I think we really need to think about how we talk about online harm and how we educate children. We did a piece of research for ICSA on how children are taught around online sexual harm in schools. And actually, even the names of our programmes, or the messaging is to a child, it's your responsibility to keep yourself safe. We run programmes like Keeping Yourself Safe. And young people told us in that study that actually they felt they couldn't tell someone when something happened because they felt it was their fault. They'd been told to use privacy settings, they hadn't used it, therefore they felt they couldn't say. So we also need to really, as well as kind of the logistics of what happens on an online platform, we have to think about how we reframe this so children don't feel it's their responsibility and aren't prevented from telling us when something happens because they think they'll be blamed for not following advice.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, Chair, so I'll yield the floor.
Thank you. I'm very sorry. Assemblymember Best.
Thank you. Just wanted to follow up on the social media and ask if there was any particular platforms that cause most concern. Perhaps Lindsay.
Oh, I apologise. I thought you'd taken it down. Junior.
To be honest, the work that we've done is practically every single platform has been used in some form. And just to really sort of put this in the thing, it's not actually just the platform, it's the fact that there isn't the safeguards in there. So to give you an example, let's just say you have you're posting a video and I don't know, you've got a well-known artist, you know, for example, Ed Sheeran's playing in the background. Usually the algorithm will pick that up straight away. If you post that, usually the sound will get blanked out. You could get a warning against your name. Something like that could happen. With these sort of things, there are no algorithms that detect, for example, nudity, detect differences in age, differences in demographic. There's none of that. And so what a lot of young people, when we've gone into schools, for example, with our SOS project, which goes into schools, colleges, and universal spaces where young people are. If you say to a young person, okay, what's the rules for staying online? They tend to spit it out almost like they've learned the diatribe, like, you know, do not arrange to meet with strangers, do not talk to people you don't know, do not accept gifts. But as you know, in reality, they're communicating with people they don't know all of the time. Certainly, we've seen it in the press recently. People have been meeting up with people that they don't know or people that they think they know online. And another thing to say about the online spaces is, because they're unsupervised, because there's no sovereignty in that space, there are no laws. So people often say to us, oh, does this happen a lot on the dark web? No, it actually happens on the clear web all of the time. And we've even seen it through music sharing apps, Grooming, happen over the last couple of years. So it really is, it's a really big space to work with. And also, how to engage the people once they're involved, because there's a lot of shame, there could be a lot of stigma involved. Imagine if you're sharing images of yourself, by virtue then you're not going to necessarily come forward and speak to an adult or somebody that you trust. Or even if you do, they might be people that you've met through the online spaces who may just endorse what you're doing anyway. So it's really having that kind of clear, being able to get through to young people in a really clear and effective way, and also show them how to, and it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be like you actually have to protect yourself online, but that is a reality of what you have to deal with, unfortunately, for young people in this social media age.
Just a very quick one.
Really
if you're not
quick,
already
please.
speaking to the Social Media and Intelligence Network, SMIN, in the Met, I would absolutely recommend you speak to them. Some absolutely fantastic practice that's going on to understand social media, the platforms, how they're being abused and manipulated, but also not just the proactive kind of work that they're doing, the prevention side that they're doing, both from a proactive and reactive space, and just AI. AI is a big thing now, and they will talk to you very specifically about how AI is being really capitalised in this space around children and image. So even if they don't provide an inappropriate image, they will make it inappropriate.
Thank you. Assemblymember Best.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just follow up that there are filters, obviously, on nudity and things like that. That was just a comment that there was. So there is, but I think, and if we had more time, I was going to ask about teen accounts and strengthening those filters, because they do exist. It's just how well they're implemented. But Lindsay, I wanted to come to you just really quickly to talk about the London institutions. And I think this is where sometimes we get confused, and I've seen this conversation already getting confused, as why are we kind of drill down on this area of grooming gangs? And the issue is bad people exist, right? I think we all accept that. But what we want is our institutions to deal with bad people in the right way. And what happens is when you get this high trust group who are enabled by an institution, that's where we're really concerned. I was intrigued, Aisha, when you mentioned the church not being brought up, and I thought, well, I think the church is being dealt with exactly the same way. And I hear jokes about the church very often in terms of paedophilia, because of the way in which the church has been tarnished by a lot of that. So, and that's the same kind of thing as we're talking about here, as those high trust group institutional enabled kind of perpetrators. And Lindsay, I wanted to know, in London, how open do you think our institutions work with you and your victims in order to find resolutions and really confront issues? Or do you think there is a sense that they're not giving the information out, that they are not fronting up to the issues at hand?
I think there's definitely been improvement. I think COVID, if I'm honest, has helped in terms of our access to meetings, because there's been that openness around online meetings and wider invites than previously. So I think there has been some positives in terms of access to meetings, but I do think that's by the situation of things like COVID. I do think there is an acknowledgement around the information that we hold as third sector that is unique to us because of that trusting relationship that we have. And I think there's an acknowledgement that that's needed because it's not being gathered elsewhere. I do think there is some resistance because we do, with that information, come with challenge because we are almost like a critical peer because we are holding accountability to say what has happened, you know, what actions are being taken, this is the evidence. So just to give a really brief example of that, we've been told, and again, I'm just being mindful so that I don't expose any information to any one single person that we've worked with, but we've had multiple pieces of information that have been shared by us via the families that have gathered information around trafficking and exploitation and harms that have been experienced by their child. We've been told that there's not enough information for that to then be put through for an NRM to register that child as a trafficked child. But that is because the systems are not speaking to each other. There's not been a collaborated approach between services, social services, police, etc. And because it's been cross boroughs. But when we've then gathered that and we've filled in, we're not first responders for an NRM, but we've completed an NRM form to just show how much information has been there. And it's that kind of challenge that we're having to put to services sometimes to say, you know, we're having to coordinate that information where it's not being done between their systems to highlight that there's risk and harm. And when we're talking about the risk and harm for this one particular person that I'm thinking about us doing this with, and I have multiple examples of this, they were experiencing the highest levels of harm, multiple rapes, multiple attacks daily. So to say that they didn't warrant the NRM referral is, you know, it's really difficult to hear.
And just one final question, Chair, is how much of that inappropriate terminology from institutions do you still see in London, for example, calling paedophiles boyfriends, calling, you know, sexual abuse gatherings a party, that sort of thing? Or do you think that our institutions now are alive to calling these things what they are and protecting victims?
I think I would say there has been improvement in terms of understanding language. There's been drives in terms of training for language and the impact that language has. And I certainly think we are seeing that. Has that changed the attitudes behind that language? Sometimes I have to question that in terms of the response that we see those services have to families. We still see multiple occasions where children are left with perpetrators after families have reported that they're at an address and they've done a safe and well check and left them with those people who are actually causing them harm because they're deemed as in an intimate relationship or they've been deemed as a safe person. So I think there are still failings and we can't ignore that there are still definitely failings there. I would acknowledge there is some improvement, but there is the failings within that still.
I think Lindsay's point is really important.
Rick,
and powerful
very
example.
briefly, I'm sorry, we're so running over.
I appreciate that, but I think it's important. Thank you.
Well, all of this is important, and we won't get to the victim.
I think the systems not speaking to each other is really important, and this kind of lends itself to kind of looking at how we then harmonise borough-level interventions and effective intervention. I think that's really important to highlight. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Very, very briefly, Assemblymember Ahmed.
Thank you. And I think my question is to Ginia, actually, because you touched on this, just about the online issue. What kind of responsibility do you think regulators have, or you know, people who own the platforms have to address this issue?
Wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking it. You know what it is? It's so frustrating for me because every single time that we've raised stuff, it just gets kind of like battered into long grass. Yes, I'm sure, you know, we've got to understand, yeah, online spaces, they bring numerous benefits. But the fact remains is it's still hugely difficult to get content taken down. I had a lady contact me. She was filmed inappropriately just leaving her house. And when she went through the methods to get the video taken down, this does not disobey our community guidelines. That's a human being making a complaint about that something in real life, it would not be able to happen if it was not on an online space, because actually you'd have the measures of the law. And we've got organisations that should be able to step in, but my fear is I just don't think that they have enough teeth in order to
Julie,
bring about
sorry,
the kind of
I'm being asked to move along with the chat. So effectively, you are saying, and I suspect the panel as a whole would be saying, that regulators do need to take more responsibility for what is online, what needs to be taken down. Is that a fair assessment? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, and I'm sorry to be the ghastly one that's pushing this along, but I do want to get to the very last section, is on support for victim survivors. That's vital. At the moment, we're not going to get to it, guys, so if we can speed up a bit. Now we're going on to identifying and investigating grooming gangs, and it's going to be taken by Assemblymember Clark to start with.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chair. I think throughout the course of this morning, we've touched on some of the key issues with, why it is that some of this is difficult to identify. But I'm just going to ask the question very clearly, because while we've touched on some of it, we haven't kind of had a succinct answer. But what are the key challenges and barriers that the police find when they're identifying these groups, and what are the key barriers to investigating them as well? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll keep us tight. So one is it's evidence and disclosures. So one is from a disclosure perspective, we know the ICSA report will tell us that it can take on average 20 years for victims to come forward. And it was also reiterated in the Hydrant report as well. So there is a real historical perspective around child sexual abuse and exploitation. We're underestimating how long it takes for victims to come forward and feel confident. So that's the first point. The second point is evidence. So again, I'll go back to the Met Commissioner's discussion around evidence and what we've just talked about from online. That's relevant. If you're seizing a device, you've got to think about how much data is on there, the capability to be able to analyse that data really quickly. We don't have the capacity necessarily to be able to do that in a way that would identify those networks really quickly. It has to go to digital forensics units. It has to be assessed. We have to look at their devices they're holding, both from a victim perspective to understand some of that aspect of what's happened to them, but also when we identify perpetrators as well. So the digital demand and the resources needed, because we don't get disclosures in this space, puts a huge pressure on the system.
Gosh, that makes sense. Anyone else? Okay, no else. We'll move swiftly on. What steps could the Met take to improve the way it identifies? I mean, apart from you're right, the digital assets and analysing that. But what other steps could the Met take to improve the way it identifies and investigates grooming gangs?
Actually, Helen had her hand up. Perhaps you could
I'm sorry,
pick that
Helen.
up
I
from
missed
last
you.
time.
The way it's displayed in this room, it can be very hard for it to catch our eye. Sorry about that, Helen.
Not a problem at all. I'll try to speak briefly to both. So I would absolutely concur with what Michelle has said there. I think also there is a lack of utilising the tools at their disposal. So let me say I have definitely seen some improved police practice, but the ongoing issue is the variability, and it's inconsistent. So for example, there are evidential sources that can be used that aren't being used. I remember training police about child sexual exploitation, a particular specialist unit who were surprised when I told them the offences around sexual exploitation of a child included 16 and 17-year-olds. So I think there is a lack of awareness actually of all the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism that Lindsay's talked about, all the mechanisms that are there. But I think fundamentally, and I think it was maybe Aisha said this earlier, fundamentally there is an attitudinal issue here as well. And I know there has been training around use of language, but for me, language is simply a manifestation of a deeper issue. And what we're actually seeing is there is a real lack of understanding of trauma, of understanding how that presents in children, and they're just being seen as causing problems and not actually recognising that is a manifestation of the trauma. Again, training police, I said some of this, somebody said, no, those things don't happen anymore. This wasn't specific to Met, but similar attitudes apply. But then we hear something like the police officer saying, well, she wasn't acting like she's been raped. So we have all these assumptions around what an ideal victim looks like. And I think I've written about this, that we have an inability to kind of recognise victimhood where it doesn't fit this narrow model of what we think it should look like. So I think there's a really fundamental attitudinal and understanding issue underpinning police responses that needs to be addressed. They need to properly understand trauma, not simply change the language that they use where they're engaging with it. And that can be done. We've seen that training can start to change some of those attitudes. But I think that's fundamental. And I think what's also fundamental is even recently, in studies we've done about 7 or 8 studies of children and young people's experiences of policing and criminal justice processes following sexual abuse, including child sexual exploitation. And what we're seeing actually is a minimisation of the harm that they have experienced. We're particularly seeing that, people have talked about online, we're seeing that's being seen as less serious. And we're also seeing that actually where the harm has been perpetrated by another young person, that is really being minimised and not being recognised. And absolutely, we have to have a child-led approach to young people who display harmful sexual behaviour. But we also need to recognise alongside that the significant harm experienced by the person who has been on the other end of that. And we've just had people's experiences of multiple perpetrator rape, for example, by peers, just being minimised in a way it wouldn't be if it was by an adult group. So I think there's a lot of really underpinning assumptions that police need to actively engage in rather than changing outward behaviours. And what I would just very briefly add, which is really important, there is brilliant specialist practice in specialist police units. There is great stuff going on, but frontline encounters, the first encounter for a child, is so significant. And that's where we're seeing these harmful attitudes and the minimisation. And that just shuts down the opportunity for things to be taken further. So there's a real issue to be done in frontline policing before we get to the good practice and specialists.
Could I just add to that, if I may, very briefly, in terms of the issues around victim blaming and police training, is that training, this was highlighted in the HMI CFRS report in 2024, around this kind of scale of officer attitudes towards the credibility of working class and minoritized victim survivors, and also the challenges around recognizing how victims disclose. That is not always going to be linear, and that will be impacted by the trauma that they've experienced, the coercive aspects that they find themselves in relation to the violence. So I'm drawing attention to the vulnerabilities of which may be structurally produced, i.e. in relation to poverty and economic deprivation as well. So, and also other factors, contributing factors, for example, school exclusion, the perception and disrupting those perceptions about individuals from particular communities or particular groups in terms of so-called lifestyle choices, which has implications for damaging trust, and which may compound that vulnerability and then subsequently may compound that disclosure.
That's really helpful.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to Baroness Casey's findings earlier in January, and just is there wide consensus on the panel that all 12 of those recommendations were the right ones and should be implemented as soon as possible?
Recommendations?
Yeah.
Of course. They're long delayed.
So I just want to check that that's that. Is there anything that you think was missing particularly that would be helpful?
I mean, there's 20 recommendations. I mean, the fact that they haven't been implemented in itself is
12 recommendations. 20. Sorry, I wanted to see if there was anything you wanted to add to that, but if there's wide support from the recommendations, then that's good. I just wanted to move on to the prosecutions. There's obviously been so few prosecutions for grooming gag activity. Is there something that, and clearly I've just spoken about the recommendations from Casey's report this year, or audit, is there anything else that you think could help with seeing more prosecutions?
I was going to say, do you want to go, Lindsay? Or I suppose it does. I'm trying to keep to the point of things. It keeps reiterating things we've talked about already, which is how we initially identifying, and Helen talked really nicely about that front presentation, which dictates a lot of what that engagement will be like for that young person, that child going forward. And again, it comes back to, if I was going to say some key issues, it's about the disclosure and the evidence. There's a lot of work that's being done around where we're trying to, I've completely lost the term in my head, where we're not included, we don't have to have our victim engagement, victimless prosecutions, there we go, the brain is kicked in. So we're going down victimless prosecutions where we're looking to source that evidence without the victim, because we know how traumatising and challenging that can be, dragging them through that. So I think one of the things is that we really need to push that, is that we need to be thinking about ways we can, right from that front line, think about victimless prosecutions and not so heavily rely on our victims. We've started seeing movement in that in domestic abuse because we understand victims are traumatised. We're just not seeing it in children as much, and that's a real challenge for me.
Have you seen any issues with the court backlogs at all, and that's leading to victims dropping the case, walking away? Is that?
Yeah, I recently gave evidence in a case which was highly publicised of a perpetrator in relation to a number of women who was subject to child sexual abuse and exploitation. And attrition is a significant issue. And I think it lends itself to speaking to the importance of special measures under the Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act, but also how do we achieve best evidence in terms of witnesses, because there is a level of, and speaking to the points that have already been made around secondary victimisation in terms of a system that can be very adversarial, and individuals feeling that these spaces are very alien to their lived experiences. So it becomes an evidential battle and becomes a tool for attacking individuals. So in terms of their history, their prior behaviour, the trauma produced inconsistencies. So we have, I as an expert witness working on a number of cases in diverse communities, what I have seen is that there isn't a continuity of support. There's a need for specialist provision for survivors of this kind of violence and abuse, and that we need to be. I don't think there's enough publishing of the attrition rates between disclosure and charge. So there's a real gap. There's also a gap in terms of independent sexual violence allocation, support intervention, and also therapeutic intervention. These all speak to the issues around attrition and individuals falling out of the criminal justice system. And we only have to take the example of those who are still being failed, as stated in the KC report in June 2026, in terms of subsequently being prosecuted for crimes when they were abused.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you. We saw yesterday in the press the news that the chief perpetrator in Rochdale was to be released, and there was no a 55-year-old law prevents his deportation. Do you have any view about whether these sorts of legal anomalies and the risk of the perpetrator returning to the local area may hinder victims wishing to come forward in cases such as these? And do you think that strengthens the need, what you were just talking about victimless prosecution?
I feel like that was directed at me. Yes. Yeah, it's really difficult. And how do we make sense to communities that have experienced that, being fairly close to Rochdale, where I live? I think it sends particular messages back to these communities and to survivors around this. I think I'm hoping from a policing perspective, we've got some clear safety parameters that we've put in place around what we're doing in terms of the monitoring around that and what orders we're actually placing on release to ensure from a public safety perspective. And there's a lot of conversations I'm having with Home Office around, similar to the child criminal exploitation, around orders and how we have the severity within what it is we're saying when they're released in probation, for example. But again, I think you're right. I think it's about pushing how we encourage our survivors to consider ways to come forward that doesn't require them to be, as Aisha's just described, from a court perspective and a legal perspective. That experience is really traumatising. So I'm hoping that that is the message that goes out around from Rochdale's perspective. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Very helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Wilson.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, panel. So earlier on, we talked quite a bit about data and sort of poor data, if you like, gaps in things that haven't been collected that perhaps should have been collected. And I guess this applies both to the background of perpetrators and victims and survivors. So, yeah, gaps in what hasn't been collected in the first place. And I guess it's very difficult to try and, in the previous meeting, I asked the panel, to what extent would it be possible to try and backfill some of that, and the answer was probably not. So that's an insurmountable problem. But then with the data that has been collected, I think, Michelle, you talked quite extensively about the fragmented systems, and so it's there, but it's how do we actually bring it together? I think that was kind of talking on a sort of national level. What I'm keen to understand is, particularly with the London perspective and particularly in the Met, what data is missing there, what has been done that you might be aware of to try and ameliorate that, and I guess in particular, as we want to look forward as recommendations, what could and should be done to try and make sure that all that data that we have is better able to be used, and also how we better collect the data that we don't have, if that makes sense. So, thank you.
Go on, you go.
Yeah, just briefly, I think the colleague online raised some really good points around those who are not in the picture, so asylum children, for example. I think we can agree that there is inconsistency in statistical evidence, and I think there's a need then to ensure that there's robust data collected. I think borough data is not consistent. I think that's what I'll say in relation to this, and I'll keep it brief, Michelle.
Just to go back to the point around how we're collecting data, and right at the beginning I talked about the different data sets that exist. I think there is progress being made. The complex and organised child abuse database and the child protection, abuse and investigation data sets tell us a lot what's happening. And will be able to, they're not publicly available, but they will be able to tell us a little bit at local level what's happening in the child abuse and exploitation space. And obviously they've got the group-based tag within that, so they should be able to tell us a bit more. The challenge is exactly what you said, it's the fragmented system. Every single child is, we see from a lot of the evidence from the significant reviews, is usually known by someone. They're not invisible. We keep talking about invisible children. We actually do know them. The challenge in the system is they're held by different parts of the multi-agency safeguarding response. And the challenge is how do we bring that together? And that is still a failure that we've seen from 30 years of recommendations. So that has to be a priority. And it's again what the Commissioner talked about the other day is how we leverage in some of the, the data advancements we're making to connect those systems up, because we cannot keep saying the same thing about fragmented data. People are holding that information. We need to do better at collecting that information. These children are known.
I just want to add to that. I think the other issue is, if I may just be in dialogue with you on this point, is that I think what London can do, in the Met in particular, is really, it needs to step up in terms of how it records the data across diverse communities, but also ensure that those frameworks are, that you can't apply a particular framework in relation to other cities and communities. That it's got to be specific geographically to what's going on here in London, and that's absolutely critical.
It feels like a perfect opportunity for the Met to engage some sort of AI contract that could bring various bits of data together. Do you think it's a missed opportunity not taking on the Palantir contract? Is that something that this could have been addressed by, or helped out by?
think we're in an age where we should be having diverse tools to our portfolio of work. And I think given that we've been talking about who's missing, data recording, evidential failures, issues around inconsistent recording for years. So I think we should use a diverse suite of applications to ensure that we are not failing victims.
I would also just go to Lindsay and Junior because I think they hold essential data sets. And as Lindsay talked about before, we found this in our evaluations. They are not round the table for a lot of these conversations that happen. And when we've asked the reason why, the issue that we've been told, the challenge and the reason is because commissioning favouritism and concerns around the scrutiny of that. That is the reason why we were told in some safeguarding meetings and multi-agency child exploitation panels, we're not bringing those data sets and those people in. As you said before, it's almost like go out and do the work and send to us when it gets to crisis, when actually you're holding huge amount of information. I can see Junior nodding crazily at me. And that's a challenge we're putting a lot on our, goes back to your point, Chair, about how we're utilising our charity sectors, our specialist organisations, and meaningfully engaging them in the process because they are holding so much risk.
And just to add to that, if I may, the triangulation of data, we need to pay attention to both qualitative and quantitative.
Thank you.
Just one final quick question. Is a further obstacle to sharing data, things like GDPR, does that create problems that are difficult to overcome as well? Helen, I can see you've got your hand up. Is that something you'd like to respond
It's
to?
Helen. If you can be brief, Helen.
Yeah. I would say it causes anxiety and concerns rather than unresolvable issues. So I think, concerns around information sharing we keep having identified as reasons why this isn't happening, but it is not something that can't be solved. And I know there are moves to look at improving national agreements around that would include London from a police perspective.
Okay, thank you. And apologies again, because we've got so many very good guests, we're getting some really interesting answers and it's taking up, but we have caught up some time. We're going to have a comfort break of 10 minutes now. We will come back and we will start sharp on 11:50. Okay, thank you very much. Right, colleagues, I'm going to start now. Okay. Welcome back to the Police and Crime Committee. We're still talking about grooming gangs. My first question in this victim survivors of grooming gangs in London was just to ask if we've heard that anybody can be a victim. I won't ask you because I know the answer is absolutely anybody can. So I'll leave that question there and we'll go straight on to question 9, colleagues, which is Assemblymember Hamdash. Thank you.
Great. Are there any additional steps the Met should take when considering how to identify and protect children that are particularly vulnerable, for example, children in care, to be targeted by grooming gangs? And that's open to anyone. Of course. So are there any additional steps that the Met should take when considering how to identify and protect children that are particularly vulnerable? For example, children in care to be targeted by grooming gangs. And perhaps, Aisha, if you're happy to take that, or Michelle?
I'll very quickly just come in and say, it's interesting you've posed a question about the Met Police in this. So I would throw it back and say, what are we doing more from a safeguarding perspective? Because I think by the time it hits police, it might be a few steps too far from actually identification. So I would be asking and want to be thinking about what are we doing from an earlier safeguarding perspective to identify those vulnerable children. Goes back to my point before, we have to know these children, but it's just our fragmented systems that aren't connecting the vulnerabilities. For example, the missing episodes, the absence from school. We know from the Department for Education data, again, data for you, will tell you one of the biggest, the highest factors for CSE was absentee from school. So it's one of those things that you need to be aware of. And if more education settings knew that statistic, I think they would refer more with a bit of a stronger evidence base to say you need to look at this. So I'll challenge that first. I'll let someone come in and then I'll come back to the policing perspective.
Yeah, just in terms of policing, in terms of additional steps, I think we already understand that training has to be mandatory. But I think there's a need for officers to recognise that exploitation is not static, that it's changing and it evolves, and that there's a recognition that how victims speak about their experience, but also that they need to also work. They shouldn't be working in a siloed fashion, so they need to work with other agencies as well, including buy and force specialist services. Practitioners are really, really critical for them to be able to identify different patterns of evolving forms of exploitation and coercion. And I think that's absolutely critical, because one of the failures has been around not being robust in understanding or actually being dismissive in terms of the kind of historical institutional framings. And I think that's really, really important to ensure that we are moving, that there's proactive policing around identification in terms of the way in which normalisation of exploitation may take place in diverse communities. And again, a colleague online, mentioned around having a nuance to trauma-informed understanding. That would be really helpful. And the reason why I raise this is because sometimes, and it has happened, we have the evidence from the case report around not all officers, but some officers, a minority of officers, dismissing individuals who they think may be not telling it like it is. So the perception of false allegations is really, really critical in terms of how our police force can step up.
Great. Helen, do you want to come in?
Yes, Helen.
Thank you. Yeah, I would concur with everything that's just been said. I guess a couple of other things I would add in at a very practical level. I think there's something about kind of very proactive problem profiling. Sometimes that can be a bit reactive, picking up on the point that's been raised about the information that our voluntary and community sectors hold, problem profiling needs to draw on a much wider source of data to actually have an understanding of what this looks like. And then obviously at the level kind of when a case comes in, it is really proactively thinking about other young people who may be being impacted, recognizing that someone who you first see as a witness is actually experiencing it too, but they just don't feel able to share that. And picking up on Aisha's point there around trauma-informed, listen, it's a term that's bandied about a lot and everyone says it's what they are, but it is meaningfully understanding trauma and understanding all the reasons why a young person mightn't say what's going on full stop. I've interviewed children and young people who've been threatened, their life has been threatened if they go to share what's going on, but also recognizing the impacts of trauma and how that gets in the way. So I think there's something proactively in recognizing that just because someone doesn't identify as a victim or survivor of this having happened to them, that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened to them. And I think what we also, it's come out really strongly in a few pieces of research recently, we also have to recognize that there is a lot of proactive trust building that needs done. If we want children and young people to feel able to report what's happened to them, they have to feel they can trust the police. They have to feel that they have their best interests in heart. And I wasn't able to come in earlier, but, you know, court delays, people being released, all of those things do not tell children that we have their best interests in heart. In fact, I've had children and young people say, well, I can't tell you because you can't keep me safe. They are more of a risk than you can manage this. So there's something there. And I think we also have to really recognise kind of that concerns around misogynism, concerns around racism, actually have really valid concerns, are really actually creating very real barriers as to why children and young people aren't feeling, and communities aren't feeling able to come forward to the police around this.
Can I just add to the brilliant points that Professor Beckett has made in terms of how the additional steps that the Met can take is recognising children with learning disabilities and children from households in terms of facing economic vulnerabilities as well. And also my recent research on a matter of trust with colleagues from University of Sheffield, we found a trust deficit which has impacted on being able to speak about their experiences. So again, just in terms of trust and language, in the communities that I've been working with and on sexual violence and abuse and child sexual exploitation, child abuse, there may not be may not be equivalent terms for rape and sexual violence and child sexual abuse and exploitation. So we need to be really mindful, officers need to be mindful to that, and then work with buy and force specialist services to ensure that they capture the breadth of abuse that's been experienced.
Michelle, I actually have a direct question for you. So if I ask that, then you can add. So, because Michelle, you've spoken previously about how when a child is caught carrying drugs, they're quite often seen as a criminal, not someone who is being coerced or abused. What needs to change in our policing to start to think about those young people as victims?
Great question. So one of the points I was just going to say, actually, it does link to that question as well, which is the role of policing and the practical additional steps that they can be taking, particularly from asking about the Met. We know that one of the assets that police have is intelligence. So where we've seen really good practice is where we've had that multi-agency, so we often call them MACEs, multi-agency child exploitation panels. They're called different things in different places. That's often the terminology used. And what we often see is subgroups of that really do look at the intelligence that police can share, that give us that wider picture, that allow us to understand, actually, we've picked this child up, we've found some drugs, and then what they're doing is sharing that information. Then what you get is a different picture of what's going on there. You then start to unravel what is the journey of that child and that victimization. the intelligence piece in those meetings is essential, and often there's not time for that because they tend to be used for cases and examining them. So we see really good practice when they're used as subgroups for intelligence purposes that allow us to map some of the perpetration alongside that victim journey as well. And that's just a really important piece. There's loads we can say about the kind of dichotomies and the way the police systems have to tag you as a victim or a perpetrator. You know, victim, suspect, that's a challenge. And it's something we can't get away from in the policing systems. That's where that kind of multi-agency formalised meetings are really important to ensure we're unpacking from a safeguarding perspective exactly what we're doing and who is taking responsibility for that and who is following that child through the journey.
Can I do a really quick follow-up on that? Because you mentioned safeguarding panels, and in the investigation that we had last time, one of the critiques from the journalists was that there was a lack of publicly available data on how many young people are kind of coming through the system, so we're not able to then track how much investigations and prosecutions are made. Do you think there should be more public transparency or more available data about how those panels work?
I think we're struggling to actually look at them internally. Is the truth answer there. I think if we could make them public, we probably could and should. I think there's some things about protection of some of those children and consent, etc. But I think we are struggling at the moment. And if one of the things we're doing, I know Greater Manchester are doing a lot of work around this, and I know we've been involved with some London boroughs, Croydon, for example, when we've done some deep dive work, is about when you start mapping your systems out and you suddenly start seeing you've got a missing board over here, a MACE panel over here, domestic abuse where you've got your child who is, is a victim illegally around that, and the push and pull factors that happen with that. They're all in different parts of the system, and what we need to do, and it was part of a MACE study that was commissioned by the Youth Endowment Fund, is trying to understand the purpose of those meetings and how we bring them together. That has to be a priority, absolutely needs to be a priority area for each of those boroughs, and how that looks as a Met position going forward.
Great. Helen, I see you've got your hand. I'm conscious we're short for time, but yes, do you want to come in?
I won't repeat anything, agree. The one thing I would add is I think there's something really important here about how we measure success in policing that we need to think about. And so what are we counting as positive policing outcomes? And they tend to be very driven by how many knives are off the street and all of that. Not actually, are we looking at whether we safeguarded children? So I think there has to be a reframing of that needs to think around that. And again, a YEF piece of work we've been doing that will be coming out in September. There are examples of police forces, I can't share them at the minute, but that are taking this much more proactive, safeguarding-led approach to children who are first identified as potential suspects.
Could I just add to that the issue around trust and policing, because obviously there is a trust deficit. I think the Met Police can draw on good practice in other police forces in terms of addressing issues around attrition, particularly around fear of reporting, and how that may play out in relation to particular communities where the fear of reporting may relate to immigration status or specificities of violence and how they intersect with child sexual exploitation in particular. So it would be really useful to draw on other police forces that are actually making some inroads in regards to this, and two forces in particular that I've been working with. I don't know if I'm allowed to say which ones, but you can contact me.
Yeah, no, if you could let us know, that would be great.
I think that would be really helpful in terms of a more integrated approach.
Okay, brilliant. Lindsay, I saw you a couple of times. Would you like to say something?
I'm really conscious of time, so I'll keep it really brief. In terms of practical steps for the systems and identification, I think the systems need to be looked at in terms of how easy it is to refer that information and intelligence in, and then what's done with it. At the moment, we're seeing a huge amount of information and intelligence that are being passed through, but the systems are all holding them in different places. They're not talking to each other, and so we're missing the opportunity to interrogate that information that links it to other children, that links it to individuals that are causing harm, and that is a real kind of misstep that we're having in terms of like the delay in response. And I would just emphasise what Helen and Michelle has said around trusted relationships. That comes up time and time again for the children and young people and families that we support.
Yeah, and and multi-agency. When I was leader of a council, I was bringing people in from all over, and the things that we solved because we had everybody around the table. And I think we've all taken on board that we need the voluntary sector there as well. The amount of information, especially on this sort of thing, is incredible. We need to join the dots, don't we? Absolutely. I've seen that for myself. Assembly Member Wilson, did you still want to come in on the back of this? Briefly.
If I may, yeah, briefly. When we're talking about the police or other institutions failing and letting these victim survivors down, to what extent do you think some of that is a lack of training, or is some of it more, and particularly historically, a lack of will and a lack of intent? And if that's the case, where has that come from? Have there been historic problems with sort of leadership and direction not taking this seriously enough as a priority? And then from that, do you see that changing? Hopefully, yes. But if not, then could you identify that, please?
I think from our perspective, as an organisation that's working with victims and their families, we're seeing that there's still attitudinal difficulties. There's attitudinal, these issues around how victims are perceived, how that is internalised in terms of blame, shame, how that comes out in disclosures. Again, we've covered already, so I won't kind of revisit some of that, but how there's a lack of training and understanding in terms of how trauma presents, how that impacts on memory, how that the shame and guilt impacts on disclosure and what is being shared and how it is. There's also a recognition in terms of we're talking a lot about disclosure, but actually it's more likely to be discovered. And if it is discovered, at what point in their journey is a victim and survivor, and how safe do they feel in sharing that information and with whom? So I think, because, and it was mentioned before, they're not presenting as ideal victims of a crime that would say this has happened to me and this is, and it's coherent and it's clear, and there's steps to progression in terms of intelligence, investigation and court. It doesn't look like that. It's not a simplistic process in terms of that. So I think that attitude transfers across in terms of how that's responded to then. And I think the lack of training around trauma-informed practice, the lack of understanding around what approaches survivors need to give the best evidence, give the best information, but also extending it wider. Michelle's talked about evidence-based prosecutions, the victimless prosecutions. We have a whole host of resources that are to hand that don't rely on the child to retell their experiences of exploitation and harm. And I think a training and understanding of that as well is really important.
Can I just quickly come in and just say, I think I'm always very supportive of the workforce, because when things go wrong, they are blamed. And I think the challenge that we've got here is our frontline professionals are aware of that. And we're bringing people into these services and responses with this intense scrutiny, rightly so, because they are there on the front line. What we often happen, I've done a lot of work in policing, interviewing police officers, really understanding their position, is that sometimes they are in impossible positions with this, because what they have is, there is decision, there's kind of fatigue that comes with the requirements for a charge. So we know the investigation side of things can be absolutely enduring in terms of trying to get enough evidence to move this to a charge, and the requirements from a Crown Prosecution Service perspective around that. That is a real challenge. So what we often see is it's systemic is the main issue, because if they had additional information, going back to the Commissioner's point, then it would be potentially easier for them to get that evidence-led prosecution and go forward with that. The challenge that we've got is police officers are working in really demanding contexts with very little time to be able to close these and build these investigation reports. We don't have the dedicated teams that we used to have before. So we've got to recognise the workforce. I don't always want to say this is a training issue. This is a will issue. Individuals out there are putting themselves out there as a workforce. So at the end of the day, we need to make it fit better to enable them to share that information.
Yeah. Like a really clear statement of intent from the leadership, so the Commissioner, the Mayor, would that help in transforming that kind of systemic mindset to make it clear that this is a priority, this is something that needs to be dealt with, and then follow that, hopefully, with the resources to make that happen?
I think there is that issue around evidential and prosecutorial barriers. I recently finished some research for the UKRI around a matter of trust in terms of improving policing responses to these very issues. And a couple of things that I identified was high CPS evidential thresholds where abuse occurs in private spaces without independent witnesses. Victim retraction was really common. There were also systematic delays in terms of eroding victim engagement, and the court processes, which colleagues have already referred to, can be really re-traumatizing, particularly around cross-examination in terms of credibility, sexual history, and so on. So I think there is a need to actually address these challenges around attrition to actually ensure that the access to justice is not eroded.
Okay. Very briefly. Helen, your hand is up. Do you want to say something very, very briefly?
Yeah, I would just add to that in response to the last question there that yes, a statement of intent is incredibly important, but we also are seeing a real gap between positive statements of intent around child-centred policing, for example, in the national commitment, to actually what's happening in practice. And picking up on Michelle's point, the second part of yours, the follow-through resources, is what's absolutely pertinent. There are officers trying to do their best, but in limited resources and with very intensive time demands. And we've talked about trauma-informed, and I'd just briefly say that there is a real unrecognised level of actually secondary or vicarious trauma amongst police officers who are working in this field as well. So we also need to support and resource the police officers who are working in this field.
Yep. Okay. I second that. Right. Assembly Member Small Edwards.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, panel. My question is to Michelle. Michelle, some of this you might have already covered in some of your answers before, so if that's the case, then let me know. But if you do have anything additional to add, please go ahead. Your research has highlighted a need for better data sharing and safeguarding responses that enable early, decisive action to identify and support vulnerable children. What do you think that should look like in practice?
Okay, let's go with a big question, shall we? That's so data sharing. So it comes up in every single report in terms of what that looks like. So again, I think good progress is being made. The last DFE study that was published recently, which was on the back of recommendation 9 from the Casey audit report, which was around why are we not recording child sexual exploitation and abuse? Why is it so different in areas, and why is it so different to policing data? And essentially, I'm not going to reiterate it, but it was about the relational data that's held locally in systems but is not transparent nationally, is not reported on. We don't see it anywhere else. So one of the things I would say is a good thing is that we are working very closely with DFE about what that could and should look like. So how can we rethink what we're asking for, at what level of data and at what points, to more capture the modern experiences of exploitation. So that is coming down the hill, and that's a really good thing. The big thing about that is ensuring that we're having dual conversations with the Home Office as part of their workshops around the statutory guidance for the new legislation, which is coming out around child criminal exploitation, cuckooing, and coerced internal concealment, all relevant to this committee. And it's also ensuring, because the principles that actually have come out of that committee are exactly what you've just highlighted in my reports around this, which is information sharing, professional curiosity, which I slightly hate the term of because it doesn't capture the complexity, but it's about how they're joining up. So we're doing our best cross-government. That needs a lot more work, if I'm honest, about how those cross-government portfolios are coming together. But I would say we're on the right pathway. We're starting to think about the modern landscape and the modern data that's needed to be able to respond and capture child exploitation in the format that it's happening now. But again, it goes back to my point, Chair, before about those multi-agency hubs and how we're bringing those teams together. One of the best facilitators of that is face-to-face. And, you know, everyone hates me saying this. How do we think about, when we think about the Southport inquiry, a lot of the things that we're talking about, the information that gets lost in the gaps is actually fragmentation, because we're not bringing people together to have those discussions anymore. It's a really important thing that we talk about people coming together as well as our data systems to have those discussions. And there is some real progress that's happening in that space. But I can share some additional reports that we're doing around that as well, which I've talked to the committee members about.
Brilliant, thank you. And what more do you think is needed from potentially the Met or MOPAC to ensure that victims and survivors aren't slipping through the cracks?
Okay, so I think I don't need to repeat myself. I think I've probably highlighted the key points that need to happen, which is around, I would say, systems mapping. I know it sounds really boring. Governance, systems mapping and governance, they're really boring things to talk about a committee. They are hugely important. Where are people featuring in your systems? Where have you got duplication? Where do you need to centralize things? Who is responsible? Who is around your table? And are they the right people with the right information, who are decision makers that can be in that room to do what you need to do to get the information that you need at that time? That is essential part, but it's very boring, it's very laborious, but it's essential to do.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think there's the arc of architecture of support requires that the police also work with other agencies as well, and they need to be more synced and draw out and work with specialist provision in particular. And I make an appeal around this in terms of diverse groups, those with no recourse to public funds, LGBTQI communities, those disabilities, and that will also address some of that issues around attrition rates that are evident in terms of this form of abuse.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And it's not boring, Michelle. You're absolutely spot on with what you're saying there. Now we've got a very brief question from Assembly Member Hamdash and then Assembly Member Best.
Michelle, you had a really good point earlier about almost by the time it becomes a Met Police matter, it's too late. Do you have a sense of where investment more upstream is needed the most to help prevent and reduce demand on police services in this instance?
I feel like I've given you this question in advance because it fits so much with where I'm at in this world right now. So just actually before the legislation went through in the crime and policing bill, through all my research, I've kind of lobbied to government around the notion of what I'm referring to as a child exploitation advocate. And, you know, I've got like Junior, people from Catch 22 and others that are really supportive of this notion, because what essentially it allows us to consider, and I'm having conversations with Home Office about the statutory guidance, is it's quite insane actually when you think about it. We have IDVAs and ISVAs, so your independent domestic violence advocates, sexual violence advocates. We do have children equivalents, they're just not utilised. We know that from the Children's Commissioner. But we don't have a similar advocacy service that is absolutely guaranteed, that can be commissioned as per local, and Aisha talked about it before, the importance of local knowledge. There is no requirement for areas to deploy an advocacy service for children that understands the complexity of what we're talking about. So I've really, really pushed hard on government with this, and it's got national support everywhere, and I'm going to continue fighting this, because it's not good enough that services like St Giles, like Iverson's Trust, have to ad hoc try and pitch for commissioning service. So we need an advocacy service, an independent one that stays with the journey, that can go into those meetings, that can share information, that understands what's happening in this space. So for me, that is a real key factor we need to be pushing on.
Helen, do you want to come in very quickly?
Yeah, I would entirely concur about the importance of that advocacy role and the importance alongside that of actually long-term funding of it, not year-round funding, so children know that there is a consistent service for them. I guess, and I know I come from a slightly different perspective on this, but I have a slight anxiety that if we only look at child exploitation, we're actually divorcing children's experiences of any form of exploitation from actually other forms of abuse and harm that they experience. So I think it's just really important, as everyone has said earlier on, you know, we have to look at children's experiences of harm in its most holistic sense. Some of that may be defined and fall under the labels of child exploitation, whether criminal or sexual. Some of it falls under domestic abuse, falls under child sexual abuse more generically. And I guess my plea is, as we take this forward, that we don't fall into another type of silo in trying to address the silos that we currently have. We have to think about all forms of harm, irrespective of how we label it. It's about how a child experiences it.
I agree with that. And just for clarification, the model that we've advocated as part of that exploitation absolutely takes into consideration the parental, is the context of the whole child in their experiences of life in and outside the home. It's just that we absolutely know there is a real challenge with the current children's social care system in being able to deal with extrafamilial harm right now. And we know that from the evidence we've gathered so far. So I completely agree with you, Helen.
Could I just add one point to that as well? I completely agree with the advocacy, it's so needed. But there's also some really simple, cost-effective steps in terms of early awareness and prevention. You know, if we have early awareness sessions, we've run over the last 2 years, we've run them in London specifically. We've had over 2,000 parents attend these. That is the first line of defence when we're looking at this. So having an awareness of what you're seeing, understanding what some of the signs and indicators may be, making sense of what you're seeing within your own children's change of behaviour, but also extending it to the clubs, education, that are there with children in those early stages that would see these first signs that something is changing, that something is not right. That's where we need to be investing as well. And it's really cost effective to be able to do that.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. Michelle, just wanted to come back to data sharing, and one of the issues we've heard from schools in London is around the dissolving of the Safer Schools team, and that they actually used to do a lot of data sharing around live cases, and schools would vice versa sharing information. Is that something you've also seen in your research?
It's such a challenge because education are absolutely a key partner in the safeguarding arrangements. Yet I know there's still some challenges about how we formally recognise them and bring them into those spaces. I think there's some learning to be done. I think you're right, exactly what you're seeing there and the challenges around that. Again, it speaks to where and how we are ensuring that coordination, because we've had some great examples from Croydon previously about how they're utilising some of their connections into education to really essentially bring that back and forth feedback of intelligence and referrals, and being able to really understand what's coming in and understand some of the wider patterns that are happening in the school areas as well from a contextual point of view. Just one point that I'd raise is one of the kind of innovation areas we've seen in this space around data sharing is actually in Wales, and they're actually piloting a single method. It's called the All Wales Integrated Referral Form, and basically it's one referral form for the whole of Wales, for all the professionals and the public. And they have built this and co-produced this with all of their partners. And it's something to just watch out for, because it's about sort of 3 months running now, but there is something really powerful in being able to have that one platform of information that everyone is able to feed their information in, because that first point of contact has been raised by everyone. The label of harm, how that comes in, dictates the rest of the journey. So getting it right at the front door is really important, and making it accessible so everyone can fill that in.
But can everybody see that? Because that's so everyone can use it to refer. Can everybody see that? That's okay.
Yeah.
Because I think that's where the data's being lost here, which is the issue. So that's good. Okay. Thank you. And I just have one more question, Aisha, for you on identifying victims within London. And you've previously raised that you think it creates a harm how much white women are portrayed in the media compared to ethnic minorities. Is that something that you think extends to the grooming gangs?
Say that again?
So you've previously raised that you think it's harmful how much more white women are portrayed in the media when they're a victim of crime, as opposed to those from other ethnic backgrounds. Do you think that's something that extends to grooming gangs?
I think it's important to recognise that there are numerous victims, and I think we have to be very careful of essentialising particular forms of experiences. in relation to understanding the wider context of the different manifestations of whether that's group-based child sexual exploitation, where there are manifestations of grooming, I mean, that's the kind of broad term that's used. I think it's important that we recognise that it has, that we don't frame it in a way that singles out one particular type of victim, because there are numerous victims, and I just think it's really important that we don't create this hierarchy, because it has ramifications for access to justice and support and reporting. I think the way in which particular forms of harms are experienced lends itself to saying that a particular victim in a particular community, that their experience is more valid than someone in another community. So I think it's very important that we don't create this hierarchical approach.
So do you think that's happened in the case of grooming gangs?
I think there's been a racialised signifying discourse that has ramifications for the way in which particular communities have been targeted.
Just in terms of reporting in the media, do you think that that white victims, female victims, have been overrepresented, and that the stories of victims from ethnic minorities haven't been?
I think my work in particular on sexual violence and looking at the nexus between child sexual exploitation and child abuse highlights that we have not paid enough attention to victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation in black and racially minoritized communities.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Now we've come to our last section, which is support for victim survivors, which is so important. Unfortunately, colleagues, we're half the amount of time we were hoping for. So I'll start the questions. What recognised best practice approaches should police follow when supporting a victim survivor of grooming gangs? Who comes forward to make a report? And how can the police best balance gathering evidence with avoiding additional trauma to the victims? It's a difficult question to answer, isn't it? Who would like to start? Helen.
Happy to start on this. I think we've already talked about some of the ways of thinking about looking at evidence differently and different sources of evidence, which takes the weight of the child being the key source of that. I think that there's really, as I say, we have done a series of studies with children and young people, including in London, of their experiences of child sexual exploitation, and there are really clear messages that come across. Firstly, is that actually small things make a massive difference for young people. So, you know, this is not, yes, we need wider systems change, but actually small things and how things are done can make a really big difference. A lot of what young people say would make their experience of going through policing processes easier is actually already there in best practice guidance. So it is there, it is permissible, but it's just not being consistently implemented. And I think, you know, we're still seeing it's getting better, but we're still seeing issues around children wrongly being advised about not being able to have therapy. So there's still a lot of misunderstanding around pretrial therapy, and that is leaving false messaging around that is leaving children holding trauma in a situation, as we've just discussed, that has prolonged delays to even get through a system. So we need to police need to be giving very clear advice around the children can have pretrial therapy. They need to be linking them into them. Again, in a study we're just finishing, children have been saying, or parents have been saying, I kind of had to go searching. I was just lucky I found it. If police had just told me about this in the first place, I could have been linked in. So there's a very important signposting role for police to play there. And we have talked about, so whatever we call them, and thank you, Michelle, for your response around the labelling of child exploitation. We do know that the role of an advocate, whatever we call it, where children get a CHISVA, a child independent sexual violence advocate, it makes a massive difference to their experience of the system, both in terms of making sure they have the right support, but also in terms of navigating what is an inherently complex system full of things that the majority of us who don't work in it don't entirely understand. So that, you know, police best practice is partly what police do. And again, I can share the reports, lots of really clear messages from children about how you make video recorded interviews better, achieving best evidence better. Special measures people are making well-intended assumptions about the special measure that's best for a child, when actually the child may feel and their family may feel that a different special measure is much better. So really clear themes around that, both what police can do themselves, but also the really important role police play in linking in to other sources of support for children.
Thank you. Anybody else? No. Okay, we'll then move on to Assemblymember Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, we're here to discuss London matters, but obviously you'll have experience from other police forces. But what are victim survivors of organised child exploitation groups told you about reporting their experiences to the Met and how they were treated throughout the process? Anybody really?
In terms of what we're seeing in the families that we're supporting, there's a real issue in terms of how many times they have to approach to tell their story. That revisiting, retelling is really traumatic. That in itself causes later problems. And in terms of the recognition of harm around that, it's whilst we're aware that there's harm, it's not being responded to in a way that it's changing practice in how that is approached. So I think there's the issue with that. There's also there's an issue in terms of feeling like the recognition of risk and threat that they're under or could be under or exposed to isn't being identified. So in terms of them speaking, in terms of the response that they get, where that might take place, in terms of, say, if they're being asked to do an interview, where that interview takes place, if they're asked to give information, how that is done in a way that feels appropriate for them. You know, we've got a real lack of use of intermediaries in terms of the kind of interviewing process for children that need additional support as well. We're seeing a lack of that. But I think from our perspective, one of the fears and the things that comes out the most is the fact that their danger isn't recognised and the risk of talking. So as I mentioned, it's thinking about, you know, the approaches that often get offered are around target hardening. So it may be, let's put physical protections on your property where you live, but actually it's not thinking about the psychological risk, the psychological harm. We're not looking at how that's impacting them in terms of movement and threat. Yeah, I think the risk assessment is probably one of the four things that comes to us from victims and survivors.
Okay. Is this a specific... Is the Met noticeably better or noticeably worse, in your opinion, than other police forces, if you're able to answer that?
I would say that it's across the country.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it's any better or any worse. I think there's pockets of good practice and pockets of not so good practice. But if we're not hearing what the survivors and the victims are saying in terms of their experience of risk and harm and where that threat can come from, we tend to get an application of a standardised response of, OK, so we'll put a fireproof letterbox on, we'll put a marker on your address. These are not individualised to the threats that the children and the families are experiencing. We need to have conversations that look at how are you experiencing that threat? Where is that threat potentially coming from? How do we mitigate and reduce the impact of that? How can we do that so that then you're feeling supported and able to stay on the process of kind of sharing what's happening to you and being supported through a trauma perspective as well?
Okay, and obviously... Oh, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Professor Beckett, I do apologise. Junior. Oh, Junior as well. Sorry. I've only got one hand on my screen.
Junior, do you want to go first? You had your hand up before me.
I think all I really wanted to just sort of say was that there's a massive element of shame. There's a massive element of delay. I think it's so sad to say it, but the young people that we're working with, they really just don't have faith in the systems around them. They don't have faith. Many of them have lost faith in the law. They're more fearful of the risks that are going to happen from them stepping forward than they are about any form of justice being done, and if at all. And unfortunately, that's the narrative that's been backed up by years and years of evidence of showing them. So often we hear it so like, no, they're hard to hit, they're hard to reach. No, I think they've just been easy to ignore. And I think that we have let them down because they watch what the adults do and they watch how effective we are at what we do. So it's one thing telling them, yeah, come forward, you'll believe, but then you're interviewed by somebody who's got no lived experience, no understanding of your reality. You're being asked to recount a very traumatic incident over and over and over again. And then even if you do get to the court, you're cross-examined, all of your history is pulled up in front of you, the person could still walk free. It's so sad for our young people. It really is.
Thank you. Professor Beckett.
Yeah, well, you've just said some of what I was going to say, Junior. Thank you. Just building on that, I think if I'm thinking about what children and young people have told us about their experiences, it's that police just don't, with exceptions, there are good exceptions, but generally their experiences are that police do not understand how significant this is, what an enormous thing this is for a child to share what's happened or it's been found out and they've had no choice around that and to have to go through this process. I mean, the language they talk about, their life blowing up, devastation, the language they use to describe experiences of policing process replicate the language they use to describe their experiences of abuse. I'm coding data this morning and I've literally someone saying it's like being abused all over again, going through the criminal justice process. So I think there's something really important that they don't feel police actually understand. In the project that's coming out soon, I interviewed an 8-year-old who just felt like the police were just didn't want to be there, didn't want to take time with her, and she's sharing such a horrendous thing that's happened to her. So I feel we've lost humanity in the system a little bit. We need to really understand the difficulty of this for children and young people and be really careful that actually what we do doesn't replicate abusive power dynamics. So when we train, we use a quote from young people and people think it's around abusers, but they're talking about their experience of police. When they needed me, I had to go. Then I didn't hear anything. Then I had to go. So we really have to think about how we actually, our police processes can replicate abusive power dynamics, but if we do them better, they can actually start to offset some of that. And young people give, as I say, I can share reports, give lots of really practical examples as to how that can be done better.
Thank you. Just a final question is that as public perception of this whole, relatively hidden world to many of us grows, has there been any improvement, discernible improvement in the way that the police handle these cases, or is it very much still rooted in the old attitudes and behaviour of the past?
I think from my experiences giving expert evidence in these kind of cases, I think there is a ripples of change. So I am optimistic. I think there are some really good officers out there, including those officers in the Metropolitan Police that I've worked with on very serious child sexual abuse cases in the last 5 years in particular. And I think it's really important that we recognise that police officers are drawing on expertise within diverse communities, particularly in terms of violence that's experience of this kind in Black and racially minoritized communities. And we're seeing some of the fruits of that bearing in the sense that some victims are feeling that there is some justice because the investigation processes are such that officers are making use of achieving best evidence, of prioritising victims in terms of the priority victims codes, putting in place, for example, special measures. So I would like to say there is optimism, but at the same time, we need to balance that with recognition that there is also a trust deficit, and that's already been spoken about this morning.
Thank you. Professor Beckett, is that a residual hand or a wish to come in?
No, but Aisha said, I do think, I've been researching in this field nearly 20 years in the field of child sexual exploitation, and we are definitely in a better place than we were. And I think it's really important that we do recognise that, and we do recognise the efforts that have been made, but absolutely concur, we still have a long way to go. The key issue is a young person's experience can be radically different depending not only on the force they engage with, but the very officer that they engage with. So consistency remains our challenge. How do we spread out this better practice?
Professor McManus.
Just a last point. So where we've seen sort of really proactive, I suppose, responses to the recommendations, say, for example, from Katie, and on the last DFE study, it was great to hear, but though it wasn't consistent, that some of the areas we were deep diving in had literally taken those recommendations, sat down with their multi-agency partners and gone through and said, right, where is our data? What are we not doing? Where do we need to join this up? And took a real proactive approach in trying to get ahead of what was coming down the line. But we did not see that in every area, where they felt confident if someone came back to them with those recommendations, they would be able to answer what they knew, what they didn't, but what they were doing going forward to ensure that they were obviously in a better position, as you talked about there. And I think we've got to think about the context at the moment as well. There is so we are making progress. I love the word ripples. I think ripples is about rise of where we're at, because don't forget, right now we've got a whole new load of legislation coming in. So the Children's Wellbeing Bill, we've got the Crime and Policing Bill, which is going to come with a load of new things that are required. The children's social care reforms, the requirements for the absolute restructuring that's happening, and the Assistant Director of Children's Services has talked about the real challenges in implementing these and concerns of the pace that's required. There is potential risk that can dismantle all of what's going on in terms of good practice, because there is so much change coming down the pan. And when I ask police forces what are they doing to ensure they've got the resources and safeguarding partnerships to respond to child criminal exploitation, because it's going to come in fast when that legislation lands, how is it going to interact with child sexual exploitation? Who's it going to sit with? What teams? Where's the digital? No one really answers that question right now. So yes, there's ripples, but where are we in this landscape? There's a lot that's landing in the next year.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just and very briefly, just to recognise that the police have been really, I've noticed in the last 5 years that they also recognise that there are diverse perpetrators as well, particularly powerful perpetrators. And I say this in relation to black and racially minoritized communities, where those powerful perpetrators exist in plain sight and often are not being held accountable for their abuse against vulnerable black and racially minoritized victims of child sexual exploitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll just quickly pick up on this. Helen and Junior, your comments about how these victims or survivors feel. I've seen that myself when I've spoken to so many of them. And Lindsay said about the police not recognising the danger some of the victims are in. They absolutely don't, and they don't recognise the danger some of those of us that speak out about it are in. And that is something that needs to be looked at, in my view. We've only got about 10 minutes left, but Assemblymember Hamdash, if you ask your question.
Great, thank you. I know some of the panel have made recommendations about improving training for police officers to support victim survivors. It'd be good to kind of flesh out what specifically do you think needs to improve in terms of the training that's provided to police officers, and perhaps if we start with Aisha.
Gosh, where do I start? Huge task, but nevertheless, I think there is a need to recognise diverse harms related to child sexual exploitation, that there is a recognition of the manifestations of how abuse is experienced, and if there isn't a language to say this has happened to me, that they should be working with support agencies to put in safeguarding mechanisms, and that there is more work needs to be done around disclosure, particularly around silence in particular the communities that I work with, where there's can be seen as betrayal and stigmatization. That shouldn't be an excuse for not intervening and responding and ensuring that the response is just rather than unjust.
Can I just come in on that as well? Sorry. And my biggest thing with training is so what? And it's a real big thing. We've had that from training before. So a lot of the time what we're doing is delivering great training, but then practitioners are left with, so what do I do with that now? So I'm informing you about, trauma-informed practice, what we should do, how we do that, where does that go? How do I ensure that that is being taken away? And actually, implemented into practice. And I think we're not very good at understanding what works well and can be implemented in training. We don't review how that's been embedded over time, where there's gaps and what needs to be done. So my question will always be with training, let's not just do training, you know, that often we do training silo for police, and what we need to be thinking about is they're a cog in a wheel. So they often have to be with other partners to understand what part they play and how that can link to other parts of the system. You've heard this time and time again in this committee and the previous one before. So my plug here always is, when we think about training, it is asking that, so what? What is this going to do that's going to make a difference? How is that going to make a difference? And how do we review that implementation and practice change going forward?
Having worked in the NHS and like the breadth of mandatory training, and then trying to wade through what's actually coming from that training is such a good point there. Junie, do you want to come in, and then we'll go for Helen?
Thank you so much. I think not just training for the police, but I think we should be talking about training for the courts and the judicial system, seeing as that's where the perpetrators are coming through. For the CPS as well, I think they need to be looking at what makes a victim. They need to be ironing out the kinks that's allowing so many of these perpetrators to go through, and so many cases not to reach trial or charge. I think the training needs to be trauma informed, and I think, because given what we said earlier about the voluntary sector and how much they're actually having to pick up the slack purely through lack of funding within the sector, I think there's a good opportunity there for this training to be co-delivered with credible voluntary sector organisations. And I think it also means what we need to do is have actually longer term support for victims, survivors before, during and after the criminal justice process. I said this previously, I think somewhere someone's doing an equation that's saying, like, these are the amount of hours, this is the amount of time, and that should be enough. And I'm telling you, that equation is wrong. We actually need a lot more time. And I think, like anything else, once we open our eyes to what's actually happening, that you'll realise how much is actually missing and how much more then needs to go into it. So I think also one of the big voices that are missing from this is the voice of lived experience. I'd love to hear from the survivors, their experiences, and I'd like to see them being able to shape services so that we can make it better going forward.
Such a great reflection. Thank you. Helen, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, thanks. Again, concur with all of this, and I guess just building on that, Michelle's point about so what is absolutely critical. Police have so many things they have to do training on, so this can't just become another tick box exercise. And I think there's something about being smart around this and thinking about what is the broad brush approach we can take to training that actually supports police to deal with multiple types of harm. So a theme that's come up recently in research is lack of skills of how to engage with children and young people. So if we can do training around that covers lots of encounters they may have with children and young people. Obviously, we've talked there about understanding trauma, but if we think about it in its broadest sense and not kind of doing it just around CSE, but thinking about these broader things and then the specific manifestations within it. So I think there's something about thinking smart so it doesn't become 10 more courses that police have to do about 10 types of harm. And I think the other thing I would say is picking up on the so what. The thing that when we've trained police or prosecutors, our training is based on what children and young people have told us in research. And actually, yes, there's always one or two who are resistant to it, but the vast majority of people, when they actually hear from children and young people the practical implications of their actions and how it left them feeling, and how if they did something different, it would make such a big difference to a child or young person. It really, it is about changing hearts and minds as well. It's not just knowledge. And we can really see that change happen from very resistant people at the start of a 3-hour training session to going, okay, picking up Michelle's so what, I can go away, and if I make that practical change around giving a choice, that makes a big difference to a child. So I think it is also thinking about what is the driver within training that's going to drive change, and it's understanding that change in practice makes, and it can make an incredibly significant difference to a child or young person at one of the worst times of their lives.
Could I just add one extra point onto what Helen and Junior said there around lived experience and the importance of having that voice in any training, because it really does change the output that you get. If you're thinking about the number of victims that come to us that say that first contact that I had with a professional decided whether I was going to engage or not again for the future, or what that looks like. And if we're thinking about it from a professional's perspective, a lot of them come to us and talk about not feeling confident in being able to build relationships, being able to kind of have those conversations that build trust. What does that look like? I think we really need to take it back and think, when we're talking about training, we need to support people who are going to be those first responders to be able to think about what does building a trusting relationship look like? How do we have those engagements? And the lived experienced aspect, I completely agree with Helen. When you've heard the impact that your interaction has had, it is the most powerful thing to start to think about to change your behaviours and responses in the future. We've developed a programme, a Train the Trainer programme of lived experience voices. We have to remember lived experience isn't a homogenous group, so we have to continuously get different voices and different experiences within that as well. And the rollout of that we did for County Lines Train the Trainer with the National County Lines Coordination Centre and Suffolk University, over the last year we've been delivering that. It's had phenomenal success, and it's so cost effective in terms of being able to deliver that. So there's things that can be done that doesn't have to break the bank, but can be so effective if we have lived experience voice at the centre of it.
And just to add to that, I think it's a really important point around lived experiences, is that who is actually around the table in terms of lived experiences. So I think it's really important there's a call and a plea for intersectional representation that not only reflects those in terms of gender, race, class, ethnicity, religion, sexualities is really important. If we are going to capture and respond to and really make a difference between from report to court to post court trauma-informed therapeutic interventions as well, that we don't neglect that aspect either.
Thank you. I must say, I think those of us that have spent time with the survivors are then absolutely fired up to make sure that we put a stop to this, because it's only when you speak to them you realise the trauma that is never going to leave them and the absolute devastation to their lives. We haven't got time for any more questions now, but I must say a massive thank you to all of you. Every one of you has put in some incredible comments. We've written it all down, but if you think that there is anything that we've missed, you've mentioned a couple of reports, Michelle, that I'd love to be able to read, and that form that they've done in Wales sounds very, very interesting. We're going to be talking to the police in a couple of weeks, the Metropolitan Police. If there's anything any of you think that would be something positive for us to put to them, we'd be grateful for your insight on that, because I know that we've all got questions, but you are the expert, so we'd be really grateful for that. So I will finish the meeting with what I have to do here, and that is to say I would like to thank our guests very, very much. Thank you for attending today's meeting and for your answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman, in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members, to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme? Thank you. The next meeting for the committee is scheduled to take place on the 15th of July 2026 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting.